This is Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate second part of What If Naruto Revived Katara and Sokka's mother. If you enjoy this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And for more exclusive and spicy content, follow me on Patreon. Link is in the description below. Now, wasting no more time, let's start the story.
When he eventually calmed down, Sokka said, "That's an understatement. I remember you wiping your tongue with your coat sleeve." With his hand behind his head, Naruto adopted Aang's sheepish expression. Well, thankfully with the newbie here, mine was a little less dramatic in comparison. All they could do was nod, still grinning. With her maternal instincts taking over, Kya helpfully added, "Well, since sea prunes aren't working for you, there is still a lot to pick out from. There is Arctic hen, blubbered seal jerky, and some fish among other things." Aang answered, "Sorry, but I don't eat meat." Many of the tribe just stared at him, unsure of how to react, but a few seconds later, Sokka seemed to sum it up quite nicely. While others concurred, he said in utter resigned confidence, "Well, I guess you're going to starve. It's been nice knowing you." All Aang could do was chuckle nervously and hope that there was another way for him to survive besides sea prunes. Naruto said, "Don't worry, I got it." Everyone, including Aang, was curious about his meaning, but they didn't have to wait long to find out. A steaming white bowl, complete with chopsticks, materialized on the table with a tiny wave of his hand and an imperceptible burst of chakra. As he glanced back and forth between the blonde and the new bowl, Aang's eyes glowed once more, but this time in wonder. Along with Naruto using the Hiraishin and bending fire and water, this was another incredible thing the blonde did today. However, it appears that he has already forgotten because everything happened so quickly. He was even more perplexed by everyone else's complete silence. With the exception of the small children who were filled with wonder, everyone dismissed the enchanted performance as though it were a commonplace occurrence. The bowl and chopsticks slid in front of Aang on the table, shattering his shock as he continued to try to make sense of everything. He glanced at what was in the bowl, then back at Naruto. He smiled smugly and said, "Vegetable ramen." Aang thought for a moment more, then reached for the chopsticks and broke them apart for this new meal. He took a handful of the godly noodles and slurped them into his mouth while holding chopsticks firmly in his right hand. As the flavors swirled around in his mouth, his eyes widened once more, but this time they were filled with wonder and joy. After a little while, he finished chewing and exclaimed, "Wow." Naruto just closed his eyes, crossed his arms, and began to nod wisely. He concluded with a quiet passion that made everyone roll their eyes as they carried on with their own meals. Embrace the ramen and let it into your soul. Let it soothe your very being while its warmth spreads. Ramen is night and day, yin and yang, the beginning and the end. Ramen transcends all. It seems that Naruto had previously preached about his favorite food. Naruto's wild remarks didn't really matter to Aang, who immediately tucked into the mouthwatering combination of vegetables and noodles. He didn't realize he still wanted to know the specifics of this food sorcery until he was halfway through. "Wait a minute, what did you just do, Naruto?" "We all have our secrets, Mr. Avatar, just be patient and wait," Naruto said, looking up from his own meal of an Arctic hen. Others appeared to begin to recall as well, but Aang winced a little at the reminder of the Avatar topic. "Let's not worry about anything serious for now," began Naruto. "It's been a really long day for everyone, so we'll just leave anything important for tomorrow. Just relax for the night." Aang sighed with relief and carried on eating. "Anyway, how have you guys been doing with your training? I mean, seriously, look at all of you. You're like completely different people instead of the kids I beat the crap out of with snowballs," Naruto giggled. When they heard their Sifu's words, all of the former little warriors could only raise their heads in pride. However, as soon as they heard the memory of the numerous massacres by snowballs, their very souls seemed to shiver, and they soon lost their proud appearance. "It's unfortunate that so many lives could have been lost." Sokka smirked and said, "We've been working hard every day since you all left. We just might be able to take you down now." Katara was the only one who didn't smile back. At her brother's words, the adorable 16-year-old waterbender simply shook her head. His arrogance has always been his downfall, particularly when it was his mouth that occasionally earned him an extra helping of snowballs, sometimes even from her when he irritated her or caused everyone else to be punished, much to their dismay. Naruto smirked dangerously and narrowed his eyes slightly as he said, "Oh, do my cute little warriors really think they can take me on?" Sokka, who was not one to back down easily, gave a hesitant but challenging response. Why? Yeah." Dread began to fill the pit of the other warriors' stomachs, and they were already regretting their decision to side with the chief's son. Taking another bite of his food absently, Naruto shot back, "Well then, if my now big and strong men and equally strong and beautiful women subordinates think they have what it takes, then who am I to deny their shot at me?" The females paused for a moment to absorb their teacher's praise of their beauty, while the males realized they were in serious trouble and began to perspire fearfully. But that didn't last long because Naruto began to laugh, and it was getting more and more sinister. With his spiky bangs hiding his eyes, Naruto said, "I guess we'll see if you can back up your words tomorrow then, won't we?" He grinned at them as though they were simple prey that was just waiting to be defeated. Indeed, deep shit. The snowy village had turned to night, and the numerous lovely stars began to cover the endless, dark sky, blinking quickly in the hopes that those below would notice their beauty. The entire region was illuminated by the crescent moon in the distance, which cast a serene, natural light that seemed to be buried in the white fluff of the untouched snow. Most of the villagers were gathered with their families around fires in their magnificent homes at this time, as the small celebrations had ended earlier. It should come as no surprise that over the years, a few skilled waterbenders in the community would volunteer their skills to create a variety of larger and cozier igloos. The majority settled on a cozy house that could easily accommodate a family of 4 or more, but those with more people were given igloos that were wider and occasionally even had a second floor. Even before the warrior left 3 years ago, Katara and Naruto would construct watchtowers and small clubhouses for the kids, and they would even erect some worthy of their brother tribe along the wall that surrounded their village. Speaking of the wall, we find the 2 South Pole waterbenders there, getting ready to fix the damage caused by the warship. With a noticeable breath escaping his mouth, Naruto muttered to himself, "That big hunk of metal really did a number on this place, didn't it?" As he gazed at the large hole in the wall that allowed him to see the dark waters of the southern ocean and the moon's serenely waving reflection. As Katara turned to face the vast ocean, she said, "Yeah, for a second we thought it was going to cut clean through the entire village." Naruto turned to face his fellow bender and said, "Well, good thing I got here then. Did you throw the kunai?" With her sapphire blue eyes still brimming with unresolved joy, Katara turned to face him. She concluded with a small chuckle, "Yup, I almost forgot we had it, but it's hard to forget when the situation just screamed, emergency." Naruto merely returned the smile. "Well, good thing you did. Otherwise I wouldn't have known what was happening, or at least wouldn't have gotten here in time. Anyway, we should get started," he spoke lightly. As she and Naruto moved in different directions where the wall broke off on either side, Katara nodded. Katara used a small pillar of ice that served as a tiny elevator to swiftly propel herself towards the top with a wave of her hands. Naruto just made a single leap using chakra, landing on the packed snow with a slight crunch. Katara would have referred to him as a show-off if she hadn't thought her approach was equally impressive. Naruto shouted, "You ready?" to Katara's side as they stood close to each other's edges. They started working after Katara waved in agreement. They planted their feet firmly on the hardened snowy ground and waved their arms in the air in near-perfect unison to feel what they were reaching for. The numerous pieces of the broken wall that were strewn all over the place soon began to tremble and slowly drift in the direction of the enormous hole in their defense. Other piled snow nearby was collected to become hardened material as the numerous shapes traveled to their destination. As the ocean began to solidify closer to the construction site, some of the water was even being lifted in a clear stream. The wall began to be repaired piece by piece as the hole gradually closed and the sides drew closer to one another. As it reached the right sturdiness, which could be as tough as stone, there was a faint, constant sound of snow crunching as it was firmly put back together. They had to set up the general shape before they could make solid ice for the inner workings. Katara and Naruto were taking slow steps in each other's direction as the 2 sides approached each other, the edges they shared constantly growing wider. The wall was eventually fully repaired when both sides came into contact with one another. When the job was finished, Katara was standing directly next to Naruto, who was quietly observing while placing his hand on her shoulder. Katara was bending over with her hands on her knees, breathing somewhat heavily, and a little perspiration was forming on her head. The young waterbender looked up at Naruto's beaming face after catching her breath, and he nodded. Naruto went to the small wall facing the ocean that reached about his chest and rested his arms on it while Katara grinned back. As Katara positioned herself a few inches away from him, he mutely remarked, "Man, I missed this view." "Yeah, it must have been hard not being home for that long," she replied. As Naruto considered his former home and the new one he created here, that seemed to have 2 meanings. He quickly erased those ideas and just responded, "It was." They simply kept quietly observing the dark waves as they pushed and pulled onto the frozen beaches. Katara had to make the most of the moment, even though the stunning scene in front of them seemed almost too ideal and would be illegal to disturb. Leaning back from her position, she encircled Naruto from his side with her arms. She whispered into his sleeve, "I really missed you." At first, Naruto appeared a little taken aback, but he quickly gave her a hug in return, swaying their bodies slightly as the sounds of waves could be heard in the distance. I missed you too. After a while, she released the hug and raised her gaze to his face, her dark cheeks slightly flushed. Sorry, she said, avoiding his eyes, I just wanted to do that without everyone else around. Still grinning, Naruto said, then I guess it was a good decision to ask for help instead of using my cage bunshin, huh? Katara merely glanced at him in her peripheral vision as she meekly nodded. Naruto merely laughed before he held her at arm's length and turned her to face him. As he observed the young adult he had witnessed mature, he remarked, now let me get a good look at you. At first, Katara appeared a little perplexed, but she just stood there, her face getting a little more flushed. He noticed that she was undoubtedly different from the young child he had known. Her eyes retained their usual gleaming blue color, but they also displayed a newfound maturity that managed to preserve the innocence she had grown accustomed to. Her appearance was further enhanced by her leaner, flawless face and the free, flowing hair on her shoulders and coat. Despite not being as tall as him, she was comparable to Kya and appeared to remain so. Yes, she wasn't a young child who was constantly amazed by everything around her. She was a young adult with enormous potential for anything she set her mind to. He posed the rhetorical question, you really grew up to be a beautiful young woman, didn't you? You don't have to be that straightforward, she said softly, averting her eyes once more. His smile turned foxy as he said, I'm either really honest, or I just enjoy embarrassing you. She glared accusingly back up and then gave him a playful shoulder slap, grow up. As soon as she finished speaking, she saw that his eyes briefly faltered before becoming somewhat more serious. She forgot her embarrassment and became a little anxious. What's wrong? After appearing to wrestle with his thoughts, Naruto gave in and sighed wearily. I forgot to mention it earlier, but I guess I might as well tell you first before everyone else. Tell me what? She asked, her voice still full of concern. He began to collect his thoughts before saying, okay, let's see. I was on my way here when a big light shot up into the sky. Oh. That was Aang when we got him out of the glacier, she cut him off. He said, glacier. And she merely gave him a brief nod. Katara nodded in agreement as he sighed and said, why don't you just fill me in on what happened with you today and I'll tell my side after? I was gonna wait till tomorrow, but now the curiosity is killing me. She began by narrating how she and Sokka went fishing in a canoe that morning and encountered a troubled stream that required them to quickly maneuver using Sokka's paddle and her waterbending. They were stranded on a large platform of ice after they somehow miscalculated one of their moves and the canoe was destroyed. She took her anger out by violently bending the water next to them after an argument that didn't really surprise the siblings. This led to an unexpected outcome. A large, glowing ball of ice that resembled Aang's body in a meditative pose emerged. To Sokka's cautious annoyance, he apparently opened his glowing eyes creepily and knocked them out of their shock, which prompted her to break the ice and get him out. What came next was a massive burst of bright light that anyone within miles could see. After a while, they were introduced and Aang rode his flying bison, Appa, who was unable to fly at the time and had to swim idly in the water, back to the village. The villagers were initially apprehensive, but after interacting with their friend Naruto, the largest newcomer, they embraced Aang and were eager to see the first airbender in a century. Since they were accustomed to seeing incredible things from their silly shinobi, they were not particularly shocked when he showed off some of his skills, though they were impressed, especially the kids. When the afternoon finally arrived, she and Aang went to a nearby penguin-filled beach, where Aang persuaded her to go penguin sledding. They discovered the old Fire Nation Navy ship that had been trapped in the ice from waterbenders decades earlier after a brief but thrilling ride. When Aang's interest piqued, he made the decision to investigate it and even persuaded her to accompany him, albeit grudgingly. In summary, they set off an old emergency flare that caught Zuko's ship's attention, and they returned to the village just before the warship reached their shores. At that point, Zuko and his army confronted them and demanded that Aang be taken prisoner. At that moment, she tossed the Hiraishin kunai between the two groups, and Zuko, thinking it was an act of defiance and retaliation, fired a fireball at them. Naruto entered the scene at that point, and the day continued according to what he already knew. When she was finished, Katara stammered, crazy day, huh? Naruto nodded blankly, but his expression appeared to change to one of realization. His words, wait, hold up, startled his companion a little. As he pointed accusingly, his gloved index finger almost touched her nose. I missed a trap in that old ship. And you went penguin sledding with another man? He concluded. She just gave him a blank stare. That's what you got out of that? She asked in a monotone, but a tiny smile lingered at the corner of her mouth. Naruto cast a sorrowful glance down. He muttered, I thought we had something. The idea of them together made Katara blush just a little, but she bounced back fast and gave him a hard blow to the head. Please, just tell me what happened to you. He gave her a mocking look of pain before chuckling and whispering, just like Kya. Then he became serious once more and gave her his side of the story, saying, well, as I was saying before, the light shot up and his absorption of the Aang's seeming spiritual energy, his reunion with his furry friend, his awakening, and his return to the village were all described in great detail. All of it fascinated Katara, particularly when he reconnected with the demon that was imprisoned inside of him. Wait, back to your conversation with Kurama, what does it mean by having extra Uzumaki lifetimes? Katara asked after Naruto finished. Well, the Uzumaki were already known to have a longevity which helped them live longer than normal people, Naruto said with a melancholy smile. They could appear to be in their 20s even as they approached their late 40s and early 50s. I was given a sort of life extension because of everything that had happened to me prior to my arrival at the South Pole. With a hint of melancholy in his voice, he concluded, I'll probably still look like this and have plenty of years left in me even if a century goes by. Katara's eyes widened and she gasped, but that means you'll outlive you. She didn't finish because she now understood what the blonde was now carrying, and he just gave her a grim nod of acceptance. She simply buried her face in his chest and gave him another hug without thinking twice. W. What about U.S. and any kids you might have? She asked. When the topic of children came up, she muttered into his shirt, feeling a little heat rising to her face. Everyone has to go eventually. Naruto simply stood there and gave her a hug in return, which only made her tighten her grip on him while choking back tears. Don't think too much into it, he said, wiping away the few water droplets that had escaped as he pulled her away from him and noticed her sparkling eyes. He smiled and said, I just need to make the most of my time with everyone. Looking back, she could only feel sad, it still doesn't make it fair to you. He tried to lighten the situation, but all he could do was shrug. Anyway, life isn't exactly fair. This simply means that I could continue to share my awesomeness with the world. After giving him a brief glance, Katara simply burst out laughing, temporarily erasing any negative emotions. Now come on, Naruto said. We've been out here longer than we planned and we're probably worrying Kya, Sokka, and Aang. Katara nodded and turned to go back, but Naruto stopped her. She looked at him bewildered and froze when he leaned in and planted a kiss on her forehead that lasted a little longer than she had anticipated. That was for the one you gave me when I left, he said after he withdrew for a moment. Hakoda did say to send his love, so there you go. After that, he leapt off the cliff and headed back to their house. Katara was standing there staring blankly into space when Naruto's echoing voice finally snapped her out of her reverie. Get down quickly to avoid melting the wall with your face. Naturally, the blonde's laughter came next. She lifted her right hand, lightly touched the area where Naruto's lips were, and grinned broadly. Holding back a cry of triumph, she bent a makeshift slide from the snow below and descended the massive wall. Her blush seemed to last the rest of the night. She was eager to make fun of all the other girls for it. It seems that other people also developed a crush on their favorite blonde. So, what should we do? Naruto glanced across at Sokka and asked. Just weapons and hand.to. Hand, 1. On dot 1. No crazy magic tricks at all. With a battle club in hand, Sokka answered, mentally getting ready. The following day, at noon, Naruto remembered Sokka's challenge from the previous day, much to the former's concern. When the village was a flurry of activity, Naruto grabbed Sokka and instructed him to prepare for their spar. The other warriors briefly felt relieved because they believed it was only for their poor comrade, but that was quickly dashed when their blonde superior informed them they weren't getting off easy. Here they were, right outside the village walls, giving them plenty of space to move while being watched by everyone in the village. Yeah, no pressure at all, Sokka thought, surveying his surroundings. Everyone heard the reverberating sound of the sword's metal being released as Naruto said, all right then, and immediately unlocked and unsheathed it from his wrist. He pointed his weapon at Sokka and commanded, remember, come at me with the intent to kill. Sokka nodded uneasily, but he quickly shook his head to focus. Following a brief exchange of stares, Sokka took the initiative and charged in with a battle cry, while Naruto stood composedly, his blade dangling at his side, and gazed at the approaching danger without emotion. When Sokka jerked his arm back to strike Naruto's head, Naruto reacted so fast that it was almost imperceptible to those around him. In an instant, Naruto raised his ninjutsu with both hands and deflected the blow by making contact with the club's notch. The children and Aang in particular were impressed by the scene, but mainly because the young airbender was still attempting to determine the origin of the sword. He simply chalked it up to more secrets that he would hopefully discover in due time. Returning to the battle, Sokka struggled to gain some ground on the standoff, but despite his increased strength, he was still unable to outmatch Naruto, as evidenced by his trembling arms being pushed back, When he realized he was not making any progress, he broke contact and swiftly retreated, making sure Naruto was far enough away to observe. That was a lot more oomph than before. Damn Sokka. You've been working really hard, haven't you? Naruto praised, turning his blade back to the ground. Sokka nodded and felt proud, but when Naruto spoke again, he was startled out of his euphoria. But it has been a few years since our last altercation. As he prepared to take a stance, Naruto grinned slightly and remarked, "That's plenty of time to improve, and now you're a big boy. And big boys get a big boy fight." With a loud gulp, Sokka tried to get ready for what was about to happen. "Mom, please, bury me with my boomerang," he begged in his mind. With almost superhuman speed, Naruto charged in and entered Sokka's comfort zone, pausing briefly to allow Sokka to raise his club and deflect a powerful blow before reversing course and advancing behind him with unadulterated speed to slash at him once more. The sword grazed the ground, sending up a little bit of powdery snow, but Sokka barely saw it out of the corner of his eye and managed to roll out of the way in time. With all the speed he could muster, Sokka got back up on his feet and faced his opponent, club ready to defend. Good, Naruto remarked. "You've improved your reaction time significantly, you see?" With a playful smile, he concluded, "All of those snowball ambushes weren't for nothing. And all of the paranoia I had to endure?" Sokka's eye twitched. Naruto shrugged idly. "Didn't that help? You always have to be on your toes. Speaking of which," he said, and as soon as he finished speaking, Naruto materialized right in front of Sokka to strike at him. With a terrified expression in his eyes, Sokka tried to block it as best he could but was thrown off balance. With an opening now in front of him, Naruto swiftly moved in close and struck Sokka in the stomach with his knee. Sokka coughed loudly, dropped to his knees, and noticed Naruto had stepped back to observe him. Naruto commanded, "Get up." After staring at him for a few moments, Sokka stood up shakily and held his club ready once more. With a ghostly smile on his lips, Naruto whispered, "Stand strong, Sokka." Only the young warrior could hear him. Sokka narrowed his blue eyes at Naruto's and tensed his muscles, ready for anything, as soon as the words sank into his brain. "Good," Naruto said softly before sighing and saying, "Let's get going." Without an opportunity to defend himself, Naruto moved to strike him, but the club quickly blocked him, resulting in a single blow to his torso. This continued for several minutes, with Sokka repeatedly gaining the strength and speed necessary for Naruto's main slash before being hit hard by a punch or kick to different parts of his body. The audience, Kya in particular, watched with a little concern, but they all knew that Naruto had done the same thing to the older warriors. At the time, they all felt that their pride had been damaged and that their skills were no longer worth much, but after much persuasion from Naruto and Hikoda, who at the time knew what the blonde was capable of, they realized that he was merely testing their abilities and trying to humble them, even a little, by facing a vastly superior opponent, which motivated them to become even more powerful. Even though Sokka was somewhat aware of that, it didn't lessen the enjoyment of the experience. His bones hurt, he was constantly out of steam, and he could feel various bruises forming and throbbing all over his body. At one point, Naruto changed things up a bit and tried to stab Sokka in the stomach, but either by chance or out of a desperate instinct, Sokka ducked under the attack and knocked the sword out of Naruto's hands. His eyes gleamed from his successful counterattack, but Naruto took the initiative as he watched the gleaming weapon swirl through the air before settling into the ground behind him. "Oh no, it seems I'm now defenseless," Naruto said sarcastically before materializing in front of Sokka while he was still staring at the sword. "Never let your guard down," he said definitively before striking Sokka in the stomach with even more force than before. Sokka coughed up a few drops of blood as the fist made contact, and he collapsed to his knees, but Naruto's balled fist remained in contact as he knelt beside his pupil and leaned close to his ear. "Well done, Sokka. I underestimated how long you lasted. You've truly developed into a wonderful man," he whispered. "I'm proud of you," which caused Sokka to smile, albeit covertly and a little bloodily. It was a raspy voice that said, "Thank you." With a laugh, Naruto leaned back and began healing the minor wounds on Sokka's back with a palm that was now glowing green. Now that the battle was over, the other fighters and Sokka's family assembled, and a random warrior inquired, "How'd he do?" "He has the strength and speed I expected him to have, but there's still a lot of room for improvement," he said, laughing, to which a few warriors responded. The warriors were growing more anxious for their own session. "The same probably applies to all of you, but we'll just have to find out, won't we?" His smile was all too innocent. All of the young fighters felt compelled to give their own asses a proper farewell kiss before they died. After an hour, the spars came to an end, and each young fighter, male and female, was given a kage bunshin before they began their work. Like Sokka, they were thoroughly outmatched and put to the test. Everyone had at least a few cuts and bruises, but nothing that couldn't be healed with a little medical ninjutsu. The only exceptional spar was between the original Naruto and Katara because it was essentially a waterbending battle, which piqued Aang's interest and, in some way, caused him to forget the spectacle of the previous cage bunshin, which only served to reinforce the pattern of seeing impossible things from the shinobi and putting them off for later. It was a little more evenly matched because both benders used whatever techniques they had devised from improvising over the years, but Naruto had a significant advantage because of the innumerable hours of training he had received with his clones, as well as the fact that he had been able to form Suiden jutsus through bending. Katara knew she would lose, but she still gave it her best shot, riding the snow as if surfing and launching the occasional bullet or stream of water, but Naruto blocked with water walls and did some surfing of his own to avoid it. In the end, Naruto won by approaching Katara and placing an ice spike to her neck. Even though Naruto wanted Katara to fight without bending if necessary, he chose to forego any physical combat with her for the time being because, if what he was told was true, he knew she was simply inferior to everyone else. Furthermore, he was eager to finish another order of business. "Hi, Aang." After his battle with Katara was over, Naruto shouted and motioned for him to come to his position. "Yes?" When he approached, Aang answered, "Are you okay with me seeing some airbending?" Aang's eyes appeared to brighten. "No issue," he cried out. Following his consent, Aang turned away from Naruto and inhaled deeply, while Naruto, without his knowledge, used a particular dojutsu to correctly observe the bending that was about to occur. When Aang was ready, he threw his hands into the air and let go of something that reminded Naruto of Fa, Tun. Daitopa, wind release. Great breakthrough. Examining Aang closely, Naruto saw that, similar to firebending, his Kai was powerfully exerted from the location where the respected element shot out. In Aang's case, his Kai had silvery gray strings, confirming his innate affinity for air. Now that he had something to work with, Naruto thanked Aang for his demonstration, and everyone returned to their respective businesses in the village. Naruto simply informed Katara that he would return later because he now had a small project to work on. Katara, who knew exactly what he was doing, wished him luck and left with her family. After a few hours, Naruto was able to shoot out gusts of wind that resulted in a great shout of victory that managed to echo back to the village and startle a few citizens. Naruto would go on to create a few dozen clones to work on getting airbending down at the same time. This was made easier by his experience with the other three elements. The Avatar, or at least someone very similar, was born on this day thanks to Naruto's new achievement, but the rest of the world won't know about the real Avatar until very soon. Just after sunset, Naruto was walking back to his surrogate family's igloo. Along the way, he would receive small greetings, which he gladly returned. After a short walk, he reached his destination, saw Appa napping next to the house, went through the tarp that served as a door, and entered the kitchen, where he discovered Katara assisting Kya and Kana with dinner while Aang and Sokka were waiting in the small dining room. "Make any headway, Naruto?" Carrying a pot of leftover stew, Katara inquired. Naruto returned the smile, saying, "You have no idea." "Make progress with what?" Kya inquired as to where she was collecting the dishes. Naruto replied cryptically, "Oh, you'll see." Kya and Kana exchanged glances and shrugged, deciding not to think about it too much because strange things always happened when Naruto was around. Everyone was now in the living room talking after finishing a hearty and delectable meal, not to mention Naruto giving Aang more vegetable ramen to his delight. "So, Naruto, what were you doing earlier?" Kya inquired. Looking around excitedly, Naruto rubbed his palms together in preparation before saying, "I'll just show you." When Naruto turned his palm forward and released a tiny gust of wind, everyone but Katara gasped in confusion. But nobody was more shocked than Aang, who leapt from his seat and exclaimed, "You're an airbender." With a sly glance in his direction, Naruto said, "Now I am." Aang became perplexed and said, "Now you area wait." Pointing to the blonde, he remarked, "You've already twisted fire and water. How do you manage that?" "How did you forget that?" Naruto asked, glancing back blankly. Aang didn't seem to have an answer and broke his shocked expression to look a little sheepish. "Let's just say I'm a little special. I'm a man of many talents and secrets that will absolutely blow," he said, to a little chuckle from Naruto and the others. "You." For added effect, he concluded by shooting a tiny flame from each palm into the air near his head. "Budaiya Wadahoa, this is too unclear." With a frustrated grip on his head, Aang yelled. "Oh yeah, I learned some earthbending too," Naruto said, ignoring it. "And no, I'm not the Avatar," Naruto said after Aang gave him an even more shocked look and started to speak. "Arrowhead, you're stuck at that job." As he struggled to process this new information, The airbender's face continued to display a wide range of emotions. How can you bend multiple elements and not be the Avatar? Although he hadn't revealed it until now, the rest of the family kind of expected Naruto to be an earthbender and kept watching with laughter, so they weren't shocked by the new information. Aang was still in shock and bewilderment when Katara pushed Naruto's arm away from her seat beside him, and he turned to face her, perplexed by her solemn expression, until she leaned closer to him. You should probably tell them about the whole Uzumaki life thing, she said quietly. Kya asked, Naruto, what's wrong? As the others, including Aang, appeared to notice that Naruto's face had suddenly become serious and appeared to be thinking about it. The small fire illuminated everyone's faces, and the shinobi glanced around the room at their worried and curious expressions. He exhaled deeply through his nose after deciding what to do, and then he began to talk. Well, last night when Katara and I were fixing the wall, we talked about what happened on both of our ends the day I came back. He continued after they all nodded in agreement. Since you all know what happened with Katara, Sokka, and Aang, I'll just tell you my side. From there, he talked about Kurama, the big light, and returning to the village, just like he had done with Katara the previous evening. Naturally, the most important topic was his extended life. When he was finished, everyone just stared at him in silence and began to cautiously glance at one another, unsure of how to proceed. Well, Kana began, drawing everyone's attention. Looking young and living longer. Sounds nice, she said, feigning longing. One of them wasn't feeling very upbeat right now, but that was enough to make most of them smile and even make Naruto laugh a little. This isn't a joke. That's almost a curse. Kya exclaimed in a loud voice. Kya, nobody claimed it was a joke. My life is going to be like this. You'll all be better off the sooner you can come to terms with it. This isn't really that big of a deal, Naruto remarked. Not really that big of a deal. How can witnessing the deaths of everyone you know and will know not be a huge deal? What happens if you wish to start a family? Never should a parent outlive their child. Kya cried out. After sitting up, Naruto went to place his hands firmly on Kya's shoulders and said, Kya, he yelled a little, causing her to turn to face him. I can handle it, you know I can, he whispered. He was family, and she would love him just as much as her own children, so it's not surprising that, like a mother, she would want to protect him even though she knew deep down that it was pointless. Kya stared into his eyes, thinking about what he had said. Of course, she knew that this seasoned shinobi could handle big things like this, but that doesn't mean she can stand by and not be angry by even more unfairness in his life. You've already been through so much, she said, her voice slightly muffled by his black shirt, as she closed her eyes, sighed deeply, and embraced Naruto like her daughter had done the previous evening. He replied, I know, so if anyone can make it through this, it's me, Dadbeo. With a defeated sigh, he said, I can never get rid of that. He winced a little. As Aang spoke, Kya and the others chuckled or giggled. Dad.te.ba. Yo? He let out a bewildered sound. Just put that out of your mind. Naruto swiftly responded, which caused Kya to laugh even harder and give him a kiss on the cheek before she sat down again and spoke with more clarity. Are you ever going to Naruto since the topic of family raising was brought up? Perhaps even locate a lovely water tribe girl? The waterbender was the only one who saw her wink at Katara as she asked in jest. With a nervous hand rubbing the back of his head and an equally nervous foxy smile, Naruto responded, Yuha, I guess I never really thought about it. The young girl and the blonde were now blushing for their own reasons. Now, really, grandchildren, she said bluntly, giving him a sharp look that didn't ease his present anxiety. What? The shinobi looked surprised and gave a halting response. I'm not asking for much now. 6 or 7 will suffice. 6? Naruto cried out. So, I'm hoping for some improvement in the upcoming years, or I'll set you up myself, okay? With innocence, she said. Naruto stumbled out. Iya Yuha, wait, you know you have 2 other children? Like I said, you need to get to work. Kya said with innocent dismissal, ignoring Sokka's muttered, what's that supposed to mean? After glancing first at Katara and giving her another imperceptible wink that caused her face to heat up. After a few seconds, she turned back to Naruto. In the background. All Naruto could do was sigh and rub the bridge of his nose, wondering why Kya always showed her cunning side when she wanted to make fun of him. But when Aang returned, he was shown mercy. Pardon me, but I still don't know what's going on, he said, raising a hand. Since Naruto was the center of all this madness, the other people in the igloo only looked a little sheepish before turning to face him. Naruto coughed into his hand and focused entirely on Aang. Well, since I pretty much tortured you enough, I'll fill you in on everything and more. Naruto went on, just follow me out of the village to where we sparred and you'll be up to date. Aang nodded appreciatively. Why leave the village? As he trailed Naruto out the door, Aang inquired. You do realize that air nomads were all about love, peace, and such, over his shoulder, Naruto inquired. Aang shrugged and said, yeah I guess. The airbender became even more perplexed, but they still followed. Yeah, we'll definitely need to be out of the way. As they watched, everyone silently wished whatever might occur, good luck. With only the moonlight to guide them, Naruto turned to Aang and said, okay, let's get this over with, as they emerged into the vast open space. Finish what's going on. Just let me know what's happening, isn't that right? Sorta, but the reason for what I'm about to do and show you is because I want you to trust me for a plan I'm setting up later. What's the plan? Ultimate story time first, but you'll see. What? Aang arched an eyebrow as he spoke, but he was instantly astounded to see Naruto's eyes turn from a vivid blue to a scarlet red. What is? Tsukuyomi. Now that the young avatar's mind had been completely violated, he collapsed to his knees, his arms, legs, and eyes trembling as he tried to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Initially, he was in a world with a lot of negative colors, and he panicked right away before being inundated with Naruto's life. His childhood was filled with neglect, loneliness, and persecution, which made his happy moments like his first bowl of ramen and the friendships he made all the more memorable. But when he was shown what a shinobi's life is like, he witnessed unimaginable brutality. Naruto was somehow spared from witnessing the majority of the bloodshed, but the consequences of so many deaths he saw didn't make it any easier. Whether they were allies or enemies, they all seemed to fall like flies and be dismissed equally quickly, especially during the war involving all of the shinobi nations. Depending on who was involved, feelings of anger and sadness were always present. When Naruto lost a loved one, his emotions reached their peak in the memory. Despite one setback after another, he persevered with a strong will to defend the defenseless and the people he cared about the most. After the battle with Kaguya was over, Aang knew everything about Kurama, Naruto's powers, how he essentially lost everything when he dropped in 8 years ago, and how his presence in this world came to be. Wow, another dimension completely unbelievable. Then there was the 8 years he had been in this world, which was interesting but not as exciting. It was easy to acknowledge that this was the most bizarre thing he had ever been a part of in his 114 years of age. He was now merely gazing into a snow-covered area while Naruto assessed his response. Aang babbled, "You, vacay, killed people yes, doesn't mean I enjoyed it. But why you? Look, Aang," Naruto began, squatting and placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I did this because I wanted you to know what kind of a person I am, so there could be absolute trust between us." Naruto continued, staring into Aang's still troubled eyes, "With the exception of Hakoda, I didn't show everyone else here all of that stuff until I trusted them with all of my being because I wanted to earn his trust, but you're a special case. You have to realize that we are from two distinct worlds where things clearly function differently. In order to defend their villages, families, and friends, children were being taught how to kill." He concluded, now seated beside Aang. "People you care about are in danger from people with the kinds of abilities you saw, and you would do absolutely anything to protect them, and unfortunately, that's what it had to come to sometimes." They both just stared off into the far-off snow-capped hills and icy mountains in silence, which grew increasingly intolerable for them until Naruto spoke again. "The Southern Raiders case was a bit unique at this point. I wouldn't normally consider myself to be that vicious, but the thought of Kya dying as a result of them before I could do what royally infuriated me. I wanted nothing more than to make sure they wouldn't do things like that to anyone else," he said, his fists clenched. "Then when I found out they were targeting Katara in the first place, I only wanted them scared and out of commission, not to blow up their ships. Then I realized how abhorrent they were all as soon as I saw their damn mission log. They took many innocent lives, and the few inmates they did capture didn't last very long." With a somewhat regretful sigh, he concluded, "So in the end, I did what I wanted to accomplish, but it ended up being a bit more excessive than what was originally planned." Naruto gave him a sidelong glance, but Aang remained silent and simply looked down. "Aang, do you believe that I am a monster?" No reply as of yet. "Am I just some heartless, sick animal that kills people?" Aang muttered something that was difficult to hear. "Well, what was that?" Naruto asked, leaning in. With a sigh, Aang turned to face him slowly and said, "I said you're not." "Then how am I not?" Aang took a moment to reflect. "Because you wouldn't have accomplished all of the incredible things you have if you were. Despite everything you've been through and the challenges you've faced, you have put your life in danger to protect the people you love. It's really admirable that you've always put other people before yourself." "However," Naruto continued, "but couldn't there have been another way when you killed people?" I always wish there was, but sometimes it's unavoidable, Naruto sighed. Compared to some of the other shinobi I worked with, I don't have a lot of kills under my belt, but sometimes it just happens. Sometimes you have to make a snap decision and either kill them or allow them to kill you, your comrade, or even someone who isn't involved or doesn't deserve it. Yes, you can attempt to catch them, but sometimes the moment passes too quickly to give it much thought. Then there were the times when you had to simply rid someone of their evil permanently, if you see what I mean, because they had such a messed up mentality, could kill innocent people without feeling anything, and had already committed such horrible things that shouldn't even be allowed to happen. Doesn't mean I agree with it, Aang said with a slight nod. Killing should never be the solution to an issue. And it's good to have a mindset like that, Naruto replied, nodding back. But given how I was raised, a world like that is something you could only dream of. People are still fighting and dying in the other elemental countries, and there is nothing we can do about it. For the past century, things have been that way, and it doesn't appear that this will change anytime soon. With more passion in his voice, Aang replied, it doesn't have to be that way. Oh, and why is that? With a smirk on the verge of appearing, Naruto said. Because. Naruto continued to drawl. With a small smile, he concluded, because the world has its avatar back. You're absolutely correct. Aang only lifted his head to give his now standing companion a glare as Naruto screamed and slapped him in the back hard enough to send his face into the somewhat deep snow. You can be certain that you're not going it alone. As he emerged from the snow, Aang inquired, what do you mean? With a cheeky smile, Naruto said, remember how I said I had a plan? Having nodded, Aang asked, what do you think Mr. Scarface will do? Aang's expression changed to one of realization. He's going to chase me. Naruto nodded. That's right, and now that you're here, the village will be attacked by them when they return, Aang shouted. Yes, you're not needed here as of the last time I checked, Naruto remarked. You're needed pretty much everywhere else in the world. You're suggesting that I should go? Yes, but only if you have some fantastic company. With pride, Naruto exclaimed. Who? Innocently, Aang inquired. Naruto appeared to lose his enthusiasm, but he quickly recovered it. Me? Pointing his thumb to his chest, he exclaimed. You're like an avatar too, Aang began, and nobody can defeat you. Naruto shrugged and said, sort of. What? Aang made a sound. Well, I won't simply do your work for you. I've already done all the bullshit about saving the world and Child of Prophecy. Arrowhead, it's your turn to suffer. So what are you even planning? Aang asked, ignoring the foul language. I was picturing a group of people with a few avatars traveling the world, getting their asses in shape, earning their titles, and putting an end to the war. What do you think? I haven't really worked out the specifics yet, Naruto inquired. Why can't you simply instruct me? I take it that you already know how to bend every element. That's true, my bald friend, but my bending is just my jutsu knowledge combined with pure improvisation. He made air quotes with his fingers and remarked, I don't exactly bend, traditionally, so I really wouldn't know how to teach properly. How about Katara? By playing around, she and I have come up with anything she knows. Helping you train in the other elements from scratch won't be fruitful because I'm pretty sure a seasoned waterbender can probably beat her down pretty easily, maybe even me if I just use pure bending. With a defeated sigh, Aang gave in. That's kinda why I want to bring her too, so she can reach her full potential, said Naruto. Really? Aang sounded a little more thrilled about the prospect of traveling with his new friend. Yes, most likely Sokka as well. In a way, I did promise to release them into the world eventually. Don't you think saving the world is a pretty good excuse? Aang nodded hastily. All right, that's resolved. Tomorrow, we'll inform everyone of the plan after returning home and getting some rest. Does that sound good? Naruto inquired. Aang nodded once more before turning to return to the village, but Naruto's hand on his shoulder prevented him from doing so. Just keep in mind that I don't want you to agree with the way I've handled or will handle things like the whole permanently ending topic. All I want is for you to at least partially comprehend my perspective. You understand that I'm not a murderous machine? Just promise me that you'll fight with your heart before anything else when it really matters, Aang said, turning to face him once more after giving him a stern look as the gloomy thoughts returned. It sounds a little corny, but it's okay, I swear, and I never break my word, Datbeo, Naruto said, raising an eyebrow. He said with a sly smile that vanished as soon as Aang gave him a blank stare. With Aang still unsure of how to respond to the odd verbal tick, Naruto said in defeat, let's just go back but they began walking toward the family igloo. In any case, why did we come out here? Aang asked. Oh, in case you lost your temper or something. I wasn't sure what to anticipate after sensing your power when you awoke from your ice nap. As they trudged along, Aang nodded understandingly. Naruto muttered to himself, now this promise doesn't mean I'm not gonna kick someone's ass when they deserve it, though. But when Aang heard it, he gave him a mocking glare. It's undoubtedly been a long day for those in what would later be called the Gong, but Naruto just shrugged it off as they headed to bed. Really? Katara and Sokka's enthusiastic voices could be heard. Yes, my young pals. And I assure you that there will be an abundance of action, adventure, suspense, romance, and everything else you can imagine on this journey. Now is the moment to fulfill our destiny. Naruto shouted with pride. Is it possible to postpone until after breakfast? Kana sipped her tea and spoke idly. Gran, destiny doesn't wait for mealtime, Naruto answered. The following morning, while the family was waiting for breakfast, Naruto revealed to them all his intention to assist Aang in traveling and mastering the elements, which naturally included bringing Sokka and Katara along. Well, why don't you go tell Destiny to wait before I shove a penguin up its? Kana said, her grumpy morning demeanor unwavering. You had better stop saying that now or nobody will be able to eat breakfast. Kya threatened everyone in the dining room with her powerful wooden spoon. Even though Kana restrained herself, she still responded with a few complaints. And why have you already left? You just returned, Naruto, Kya remarked as she entered the room carrying her breakfast. It's not just me, though. This trip is a given because of Aang's whole avatar thing, and then there's Katara and Sokka. Aang added, and Appa. Naruto concluded, and Appa, of course, can't forget about him. But why Sokka and Katara? Kya inquired, her concern growing. I did say I would take them out someday, and since this is the ideal chance, why not? Kya still didn't seem sure. Kya, Naruto began, Zuko and his team will return sooner or later. It's possible that word has gone back to the Fire Nation's higher authorities, and before we know it, Aang will likely be a prime target. The Avatar is currently their greatest threat, in their opinion. With ramen-filled cheeks, Aang stopped mid-slurp and turned to face Naruto. See, Naruto said, pointing to the airbender, absolutely terrifying. Aang just returned the messy smile and resumed eating. They also have to deal with me now since I'm going to help Aang with ending this war, Naruto grinned. So your kids have the ultimate bodyguards, not that they can't defend themselves. I suppose I wasn't going to look after you all forever, Kya said with a sorrowful smile as she closed her eyes from her seat after giving them a close look. The Water Tribe siblings grinned broadly as Naruto gave Aang a thumbs up, which was gladly reciprocated. However, if I find out that any of them gets seriously hurt, it's on your head, Naruto, Kya threatened, pointing her wooden spoon at him with a certain fire in her eyes as everyone turned to stare at her. Understood. Naruto squirmed in his chair and saluted fearfully. Before beginning to eat her own food, Kya replied with a naive smile, good. Anyway, Naruto remarked, turning to face Aang. Didn't you mention some cool airbending move earlier that you said you would teach me? Aang nodded enthusiastically. It was always a pleasure to assist another airbender. Yes, in actuality, I came up with it myself. I refer to it as the air scooter. Calm down. Aang agreed when Naruto said, show me it after breakfast. When all of their appetites were satiated, they set out, but Aang eagerly wanted to start right outside the igloo, which was fortunately located in the open space where Naruto used to ply a train with the kids in the middle of all the houses. With an unbreakable smile, Aang said, okay, watch closely. He then simultaneously jumped a little and created a decent-sized sphere of air that he landed and balanced on. Without hesitation, Aang began speeding around Naruto and the Water Tribe family at high speeds before taking off around the village. As Aang moved quickly between objects and humans alike, there were constant cries of surprise and awe. It was truly amazing to witness the total control Aang had over the technique. He eventually raced back to his starting point and, thanks to his momentum, dispelled the sphere as he slid across the snow just before he reached Naruto. There, Aang said with joy, now you try. After glancing at him and moving to his own space, Naruto inhaled deeply and attempted to mimic Aang's movements, mentally scolding himself for not using the Sharingan to better observe the technique. Although he managed to make the sphere and time the jump correctly, he was forced to backflip and land face first in the snow as soon as his foot touched the ball of air. Meanwhile, the ball of air shot forward from his position and then swiftly dispersed. Nobody knew how to respond until Naruto uttered a barely audible, ow. That infuriated everyone, including the now assembled onlookers, who all burst out laughing. The four hopeful travelers decided to stay in the Southern Water Tribe for a few more days in order to spend more time with their loved ones. They gave them their best wishes, but this led to a few more feasts for some quality time with the rest of the village. Eventually, the news of the small group's impending departure spread, which, although sad, was an amazing circumstance and a certain part of history. Unfortunately for Naruto, the news of his extraordinarily long life also spread, and he was the target of numerous cases of sympathy, even though it warmed his heart to see how many people did care about him. The women's kisses and hugs also didn't hurt, so it was simple to brush it off for the time being. A week or so after Naruto's return, the entire village was gathered near the icy shores in the morning to give the group a heartfelt farewell. Naruto graciously accepted some offerings of extra food and clothing and put them away in a storage scroll, but he also packed a fair amount of each onto Appa's saddle for everyone's convenience. "Are you certain you have everything?" As the four of them finished getting ready for Appa, Kya asked. "Yes, we're ready to go, just like the first 3 times. Don't worry too much, Kya," Naruto said, grinning sympathetically. "I'm entitled to be concerned. But I know you can take care of things, but can you blame me?" Kya said, then quickly softened her tone. Shaking his head, Naruto said, "I guess not, you're a mother after all." Kana casually remarked beside Kya, "Just find comfort in the fact that you have a one-man army traveling with the kids." The anxious mother seemed to calm down a little after that. After preparing everything, Katara, Sokka, and Aang traveled from Appa to Naruto, Kya, and Kana. With her eyes slightly moistening, Katara looked at her mother and meekly said, "Well, this is it." Kya mimicked her daughter's gaze before rocking her back and forth and encircling her as tightly as her arms would permit. When they eventually parted ways, Kya gave her a cheek kiss before embracing her and declaring, "I love you." Katara replied, "I love you too." She then retreated, rubbed her eyes, and gave her grandmother an equally warm embrace. Then Sokka stood up, clearly looking worse for wear, his lip quivering fiercely, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and a tiny line of snot visible from his right nostril. After a moment of realization, Kya and Kana began to embrace him back while whispering small words of consolation as he sadly looked back and forth between his mother and grandmother, letting everything out and sobbing while hugging them both. He took a moment to gather himself, pulled back, and sniffed once more before saying, "Love you both." Both his mother and grandmother picked at his cheeks and said, "Love you too." Kya pointed to Aang and said, "You're next, Aang." He walked over with a slight smile and received a still motherly embrace, albeit one that was smaller. "Mr. Avatar, could you please help look after my children?" She smiled warmly at him as she spoke. Before giving Kana a brief hug, he said, "You got it." With a melancholy smile of his own, Naruto observed all of this and wondered what the future held for them. He was startled out of his reverie by Kana's comment, "You're not off the hook either, Whiskers." He saw her arms extended for her own embrace as he turned to face the old woman who still dared to call him by that nickname. After putting her back down, he said, "You know, for some odd reason, I think I might miss hearing that every day." He approached her without hesitation, put his arms around her, and proceeded to surprise her by picking her up and kissing her wrinkled cheek. "And oddly enough, I guess I'll miss that smart mouth of yours," she replied with a weary smile, still recovering from the brief moment of excitement. With a laugh, Naruto turned to face Kya, who had her arms spread wide, just like her mother. Law. With an ear-splitting smile, he seized her and twirled her around, causing her to yell in surprise. After putting her down, he continued to give her a tight hug and kissed her on top of her head. "Remember, do whatever you need to keep them safe," she said sharply, but judging by the sparkle in her eye, she wasn't being overly serious. She drew away and kissed him on the cheek again. With a firm nod, Naruto said in a whisper, "I never go back on my word." He then swiftly opened a leather rolling pouch and gave it to Kya. She looked up at Naruto when he said, "Just in case there is any more trouble here." He then removed one from its safe place and tossed it into a nearby ice pillar, leaving her a little perplexed until she unrolled it and saw 5 of his Hiraishin kunai. Curious, she turned to face the blonde after watching the action. "That's for visiting when we can, and don't worry, no distance is too far. I made sure of it," he replied. The realization brightened her face, and she hugged him once more before stepping back and whispering, "Good luck." After giving another nod, Naruto motioned for everyone to board Appa for takeoff. "Yes, good. Bye, Appa." With a wave to the bison, Kya shouted. In response, Appa groaned loudly, which made the children giggle. After verifying everything on their vehicle, Naruto, Katara, Sokka, and Aang waved goodbye to the welcoming village before the airbender took control of Appa and shouted, "Yip yip." Appa let out another moan and flapped his tail before launching himself into the air with a gust of wind. Everyone, be careful, down below, Katara shouted. I'll see you shortly, Sokka continued. Datbeo, we'll do our best not to die. The rest of the village laughed and sadly but joyfully waved back as Naruto yelled before Katara gave him a light swat on the back of his head. Kana remarked, those kids are going to change the world, aren't they? As the bison shrank to a tiny dot in the sky. Kya merely answered, I know they will, with trembling oceanic eyes that shed a single tear. After a few minutes, the young adults unwinded and took in the surroundings, which were nothing more than a massive body of water and the occasional glacier, but they were still quite the sight. All right, what's the strategy? Sokka inquired. Well, the goal is to help Aang master the elements and ultimately stop the war, so we have to focus on where he can learn, replied Naruto. Legend has it that Aang must first master water, then earth, and finally fire. Aang continued, that's what the monks told me. So you can become an expert at waterbending and we can travel to the North Pole, with excitement, Katara answered. We can learn it together, Aang said, his eyes brightening. Naruto grinned and said, don't count me out, Arrowhead. Having friends to support him while he learned made Aang smile. However, we might encounter some Fire Nation soldiers because the North Pole is on the opposite side of the globe. Sokka, isn't that unfortunate? With a lethal grin, Naruto inquired. Yup, such a shame. The wolf-tailed warrior merely grinned back, his eyes full of vitality, as he reached absently for his boomerang. All right, so we're in this together, Katara uttered those words. Okay then, but before we learn waterbending, we have some serious business to attend to, Aang said, pulling out a scroll as soon as she finished. He then pointed to multiple locations on the now opened map of the elemental world, including 2 in the Earth Kingdom and 1 close to the Patola Mountains, saying, here, here, and here. What's there? Katara pointed to one of the locations and asked. Here is where we'll ride the hopping llamas, he said, pointing to the eastern part of the Earth Kingdom. Then way over here we'll ride on the backs of giant koi fish, he said, pointing to some islands close to the Patola Mountains. Then back over here we'll ride the hog monkeys, he said, pointing to the final mark on the Earth Kingdom. They dislike being ridden, but that's part of the fun, he concluded with a joyful grin. It did sound really interesting and even enjoyable, but the other 3 were a little perplexed by the detours and simply accepted them as something to deal with when they crossed that bridge. The warship commanded by the scarred prince, Zuko, was moving quickly along the southern waters, and he stood at the front of the deck with his now tea-drinking uncle, retired Fire Nation general and legendary dragon of the West, Iroh, who glared out into the far blue. With total assurance, Zuko declared, this time we won't fail. Don't get ahead of yourself, Prince Zuko, Iroh said coolly, you saw what that man was capable of. You shouldn't take any opponent lightly, even though his skills are truly unknown. Together, he and the Avatar might pose a serious threat that we are ill-equipped to deal with. If you continue to talk in that manner, we will undoubtedly fail, Zuko growled. You have to be realistic about these things, Iroh said, shaking his head. Confidence can help you, but it can also work against you, he said wisely. That doesn't mean. Zuko, Prince, from the upper railing, their spotter shouted. What is it? The scarred man turned around and yelled. Desperately, the man gestured forward, saying, look, something is on its way directly to us. The owner of such a beast was easy to figure out, and after a few moments of observation, Zuko managed to make out the large, white bison he briefly saw back at the South Pole. He squinted, trying to focus on the small dot approaching in the air. Zuko caught his men's attention by widening his eyes and saying, Helmsman, go directly to the bison of the Avatar. Prepare for conflict. Everyone followed instructions like clockwork, quickly preparing both physically and mentally. After a few more moments of maintaining a stern stare at the flying creature, Zuko said, you're not getting away this time. Oh, what utter bullshit that is. Gazing at the swirling ball in Aang's overturned palm, Naruto shouted. You see, Aang replied smugly, I don't know why you said it was something hard to learn. That's because it is. Touch the jerky with the ball. Naruto stated, I worked my ass off to learn that technique and before removing some strips of blubbered seal jerky from a nearby pouch and holding them bundled together in a closed fist. Aang raised an eyebrow, shrugged, and moved the swirling ball of air slowly until he touched the dried meat, barely letting the ball touch it before he simply chose to cut off the kai, dispelling it. Ha! Now observe how it should be done, Naruto yelled. Before he touched the jerky, he opened his own palm and felt a surge of blue energy that eventually took the shape of a similar sphere. Aang was shocked to see how completely shredded and ruined the meat was. I knew you couldn't perform a Rasengan, so there you are. Naruto huffed and said, shows you to try and copy my technique. Apparently, only moments before, Aang thought he could do the same thing because he suddenly remembered the fabled swirling sphere from the memories that Naruto showed him and idly noted that it was like airbending. Unfortunately, he forgot that the energy required to create such a technique was completely different and didn't require an elemental well, unless it's the Rasen Shuriken, which is something else entirely. You mean that you had to imitate my airbend technique? Aang retaliated, saying that although he was technically duplicated in his power, he might not care as much if he had another airbender nearby and could also teach Naruto, which sounded like fun. Blinking, Naruto said, point taken. Well, folks. Look, from his position at the front of the saddle, Sokka shouted. Alongside Sokka, Katara began to pay attention as Naruto and Aang headed to his position. What is it? Naruto inquired. Sokka merely gestured forward. Naruto glanced and became alert, saying, oh, that. The Fire Nation warship that he had seen Scarface board previously, smoke billowing wildly in the air, was off in the distance, headed to intercept them. Sokka remarked, we could just turn and lose them. But a sly smile that resembled that of a predator appeared on Naruto's face, and his eyes glowed with cunning. No, where's the fun in that? I believe I would like to greet Mr. Prince, so I'm going all out. Naruto yelled while maintaining his grin. What are your plans? Katara asked, feeling a little uneasy about fighting the Fire Nation at this early hour. With a seductive grin, Naruto said, let's just get close and you'll find out. The others shrugged inwardly and proceeded on their collision course with the exiled prince in spite of their hesitation. Iroh observed, they don't seem to be changing direction. With a sense of a victory already churning in his gut, Zuko let out a barely noticeable smirk before he started barking orders to those he commanded. Remember, I want all firebenders on deck. Everyone else capable of fighting is to back them up and give support if we are boarded. With multiple shouts of affirmative, Zuko was already imagining different scenarios. One included shooting them down and fishing his desired target out of the water, while another was possibly having a close encounter if they dared to land on the deck. To his mind, no matter what he had to do in order to succeed, it was to result in his return to his homeland with honor. With anticipation growing as the distance between both groups grew smaller and smaller, Zuko paid no mind to the glacier they were approaching. Not that it mattered in his view. They were going to pass it by the time they were within striking range, anyway. Just as they were about to drift right next to the enormous block of ice easily 10 times the size of his ship, Zuko saw a figure stand on the bison's head. While it took a second to see exactly who because of the distance, it was a mere few moments later that he recognized the face mask now adorning the lower half of the person's face. Yua, Zuko said, his teeth clenched. The only difference from last time was that the hood was now down and he could make out the spiky blonde hair waving around wildly in the wind. I don't think I've seen anyone with that hair color before, Iroh said. It will be an easy way to track him down if they escape. And a bald kid with an arrow on his head riding on a giant bison won't? A random firebender's voice echoed with genuine interest from his helmet. Iroh seemed to slightly blush in embarrassment while sheepishly letting out a grandfatherly chuckle. I suppose it will, won't it? They won't escape unless you all continue to lose focus, Zuko yelled. That got the desired result as they continued to watch the approaching group. Although I do wonder what he's doing, Iroh commented while stroking his beard. From what they can all see, he was just standing on the beast's head with no problems with balance, watching them with a calm Fa section aid. However, what happened next, none of them could have ever predicted. In one instant, he was a simple yet unknowingly powerful man, and in the next, his body was surrounded in a bright yellow aura that captivated them all. What is that? A random grunt shouted. Woa, Katara, Sokka, and Aang muttered at the same time as they watched their blonde friend erupt in an explosion of power and grace. All around the shinobi was a shroud of yellow that seemed to be full of life. While keeping the same shape of his clothing, there was now thick, black lines along his torso and limbs. A noticeable black dot in the middle and incomplete black circle on his mid-section was connected to all of the black lines. There was a thick line running down each leg onto his boots that proceed to wrap around the underside while 2 other black lines also wrapped around his back. Around his collar was another line with 6 magatama under it. The face mask's Kurama. Inspired teeth were now also black, giving Naruto an even more intimidating appearance, with the rest of the mask only being dark along the edges. While hidden, Naruto's whisker marks were greatly thicker and more defined as well. This was under the eyes that were glowing with the power of Sage Chakra with crossed pupils. Naruto looked at his hands, arms, and overall body. Hey, still got it, he said. So pretty, Katara commented. What is that again? Aang quietly asked. Naruto looked back at the others, making them slightly jump. A combination of my tailed beast and sage mode. He replied, ironically giddy considering the mask. And what are you going to do with that? Katara inquired. Well, just to show off a bit and see if it changed at all throughout the years. While this is one of the strongest parts of my arsenal, I'm not going to destroy them or anything, just have a little fun, he answered cheekily. Okay. They all said while dumbly nodding. Naruto turned back to ship and focused in on the glacier. Let's give them something to talk about, Naruto said to himself. Even with a small amount of fear now stirring within Zuko, he shouted, this doesn't change anything, whatever that is, we'll just have to beat it. Easy for you, Desaya, a firebender muttered. A few moments later the bison was just about to get in range of their attack. Now, Zuko shouted while getting in a crouched stance, which was copied by his uncle along with the other benders, prepared to shoot them down. As Zuko made the first step and gathered the energy to begin the process of launching a fireball in this big cooperation technique, he was stopped cold when two massive glowing arms stretched from Naruto's own. They elongated closer and closer to the ship and got everyone to hesitate in their actions enough to lose their footing. They could only look on in fear as one of the hands reared itself back to strike down on them. Sheeta. One grunt summed up for everyone. However, to their confusion, the hand swung and completely bypassed them. They were about to sigh in relief, but were swiftly scared once more when the limb smacked into the glacier they were now next to with a very loud bang. Snow and big chunks of ice were now raining down onto the ship, which sent everyone to run in a frenzy, even the two members of the royal family. After the episode of panic and rapid sounds of metal being impacted, Zuko, Iroh, and others that were able to escape the worst of it all walked to where the snow and ice mainly hit. As they were about to survey the damage, they all heard a loud shout in the air above them. As they all looked up, they saw the bison just pass overhead with those large arms of energy still hanging in the air. They were then put on edge when both hands faced them in closed fists, somewhat looking like they were put up to enter a fist fight. However, to their disbelief, the only thing that the fists did was raise each respective middle finger before the hands moved up and down repeatedly in a mocking gesture. They could barely hear what sounded like laughter from the arm's owner as they disappeared into the distance. Zuko's eyes grew bloodshot in anger as he ordered, after them. With no response, he turned around angrily. I said. He was stopped in his tracks as he saw that nearly the entire front of the deck was covered with an enormous amount of snow, of which there was a few arms, legs, and even heads sticking out of their wide prison, accompanied by muffled groans of pain. Seeing a lot of his crew down momentarily and his ship now stuck, he could only yell in frustration with steam shooting out his flared nostrils. Ha 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 ha, that was great, Naruto shouted while dispelling the chakra cloak and sitting down back in the saddle. I would give anything to have seen their faces, Sokka laughed while holding his aching side. That was a little bit excessive, don't you think? Katara asked, but still had a small smile breaking out. Naruto waved her off. It could have been a lot worse, and I doubt any of them got seriously hurt, give or take a few. Any objections, O peaceful monk? He asked Aang. Aang thought about it for a moment. Not really, but the fingers were a little much. Whatever, you'll learn to love it as time passes, Naruto dismissed while letting out the occasional laugh that he was still trying to control. A couple of days have now passed since the group's departure, and after a few stops at small islands to rest and eat, they were now smoothly flying to Aang's home known as the Southern Air Temple. Wait till you see it, you guys. The Air Temple is one of the most beautiful places in the world, Aang happily exclaimed from his spot holding Appa's reins. Katara seemed to grow a light concerned look. Aang, before we get there, we need to talk about the airbenders. What about? Aang replied. Katara's face seemed to grow a little more uncomfortable. Well, I just want you to be prepared for what you might see. The Fire Nation is ruthless. You know what they did to my mother, and they could have done the same to your people, Katara said, sending Aang a sad look. Apparently the words didn't hit home. Just because no one has seen an airbender for a long time, doesn't mean the Fire Nation killed them all. They probably escaped. Denial is only going to make it worse, Naruto thought from the side while relaxing next to Sokka, who was playing with his boomerang. You don't understand, Katara. The only way to make it to an airbender temple is by flying bison, and I doubt that the Fire Nation has any flying bison, right Appa? He asked his friend, who groaned in response. Gonna have to face it the hard way, isn't he? Naruto mentally asked himself while letting out a small sigh. The hours passed by, along with the various clouds and small islands. With the time that has gone by, it was a huge relief to see the various mountains approach in the distance. The Patola mountain range. We're almost there, Aang yelled, practically jumping in his seat. The mountains were vast and spread out as far as you can see. Structures of rock and forest were randomly spread out through the beautiful landscape. Eventually, one mountain with a significant difference came within their line of sight. With an ear-splitting grin, Aang turned towards his friends and got their attention. "There it is. The Southern Air Temple," he said. The others looked on and their faces morphed into ones of awe. They were justified as the magnificent destination of theirs became clear. Situated on a great mountain peak was a series of visible pathways surrounding the many buildings that made up the ancient Air Temple. Its sight just gave off an aura of rich history and culture that any history buff would jump at the chance to observe closely. "It's beautiful," Katara said with Naruto and Sokka nodding in agreement. Aang now had a nostalgic smile on his face as he patted Appa's head affectionately. "We're home, Buddia, we're home." Avatar shouted to his friends, "Hurry up, guys. I'll give you the grand tour." His excitement was high. At the foot of the main trail that ran through the center of the old temple, the group had just landed in an open space beside a cliff. Aang wanted to start showing them around right away, even though they could have gone to a more practical landing area. As he stepped off their bison transport, Sokka angrily exclaimed, "It's been 100 years already, Aang. This place isn't going anywhere anytime soon, so calm down." Katara, standing next to Naruto, looked up at him and said, "What's got you so cranky?" After Sokka leapt off Appa's side, he pointed accusingly at the shinobi and gave her a blank look in return. "Your boyfriend right there destroyed the blubbered seal jerky with his stupid ball of death and left me starving all morning," he was fuming. Katara looked at the blonde and raised an eyebrow, ignoring the remark about the boyfriend. She asked calmly, "You wasted all of it?" Naruto just put his hands behind his head and gave an innocent smile in return. He cheerfully exclaimed, "Have you ever shredded stuff before? It's awesome." Before becoming somewhat sheepish, he looked at the young warrior and said, "But I guess I got a little carried away. Sorry, Sokka." Sokka's only reaction was a snarling stomach followed by an expression devoid of emotion. Naruto reached with his right hand to his left arm to activate the tiny, invisible seal, saying, Okay, tell your gut to stop complaining. I got a nice supply in my storage seal." At the thought of his fated meal, Sokka's eyes brightened and his mouth began to water. Naruto gained a playful glint in his eye and, much to Katara and Sokka's surprise, stopped his hand just before applying chakra to his arm. As he turned back to Sokka and halted the jerky removal procedure, Naruto said cheekily, "You know what? Let's make this a small survival lesson to see how you can handle not having food in unfamiliar terrain and test your scavenging skills." Sokka fell to his knees, his eyes glistening and bright, his world crumbling around him. Katara and Naruto both chuckled at the sight. With a wounded spirit, Sokka barely managed to stammer out, "But that's not fair," he concluded, fighting a trembling lip. Naruto remained motionless. "I never said life was fair, and you're the one that wants to be an awesome warrior, so I'm helping you with that." Despite being frozen in place due to Naruto's actions, Sokka soon developed a victorious expression. He exclaimed triumphantly, "Wait, there could something else in Appa's saddle," before turning around and frantically beginning to climb up Appa's tail, stumbling a little along the way. "The jerky was the only thing I unsealed after breakfast as a snack for the road," Naruto said after letting him get up only halfway. Sokka let out a disappointed groan that was muffled by the enormous amount of fur, froze in mid-step, and dejectedly accepted his fate as he let himself fall on the bison's tail face first before slowly sliding back down to the ground. Katara and Naruto merely chuckled in amusement before their bald friend's voice could be heard from the top of the nearby hill's trail. "Are you guys coming or not?" Aang yelled, gesturing with his arms to further attract their attention. With the waterbender now trailing closely behind, Naruto turned to face Katara and nudged his head in the direction of the airbender. "Come on, Sokka, you're not going to make the old fart wait, are you? He's already 114 years old, he isn't getting any younger," Naruto yelled over his shoulder. Sokka merely complained a little more before grudgingly rising and walking at a sorrowfully even pace after his sister and the malevolent gatekeeper of his priceless jerky. Aang kept pointing out everything that had even the smallest bit of significance in his memory as they continued walking down the main path. He would even go into detail about some of the adventures he and his fellow airbenders had, including playing practical jokes on their elders, experimenting with their bending, and much more. After walking for almost an hour, the group was now gazing down at an open space with big holes carved into one of the mountain's many rock faces and odd wooden posts erected. And over there would be where the bison would sleep. Aang sighed and trailed off, pointing to the various wooden posts before turning to face the spacious holes in the rocks. "That's where my friends and I used to play airball," he said. Katara asked behind him, "What's wrong?" "This place used to be filled with monks, lemur, and bison. Now there's just a bunch of weeds. Aang groaned. Additionally, Naruto couldn't help but feel depressed. With what he assumed to be lush vegetation, happy people and animals living side by side, and a generally tranquil atmosphere, he could picture how vibrant this place used to be. Now, the place was nothing more than a bunch of weeds, as Aang had said. Naruto was worried about how much Aang would be impacted as they proceeded because the surrounding area essentially exuded nothingness. Sokka approached Aang as she sensed the tension. So, this airball game, how do you play? Aang instantly lifted his dejected eyes and smiled cheekily. Sokka couldn't shake the feeling that things wouldn't work out for him. Sokka was correct. Now, he and Aang each had a designated post and stood on opposite sides of the airball field. Aang was all smiles as he unveiled the unusually hollow dot-out and cut wooden ball and then threw it with a gust of wind, but Sokka wanted to be prepared for anything. Only a skilled eye could keep up with the ball's remarkable forward speed. After making initial contact with a nearby post, it bounced off and launched itself into another. This went on for a few seconds, and the closer the ball got to Sokka, the more fear he experienced. The ball struck Sokka's midsection as it finally banked off the last post, sending him flying back through the goalpost and causing the goal ring to spin and squeak a little from its previous height. Aang shouted in triumph as Sokka fell to the snow below with a painful grunt. He exclaimed, "Yeah, Aang, 7, Sokka, 0. Naruto shouted, "Good game, Sokka," from the side. "You've done your tribe proud by humbling yourself and raising your pain tolerance." The only thing Katara did was put her hand to her mouth to try to stop a laugh from escaping, but she was easily unsuccessful. A few globs of snow fell from Sokka's head as he lifted it from his prone position. Yeah. I'm just getting stronger by getting hurt while making Aang feel better, Arita." He made a mocking mutter. He saw a startling scene in front of him before he could rise from his position on the ground. A pair of skeletal remains wearing tattered Fire Nation armor were directly in front of him. He called out to them in a low voice, "Naruto, Katara, check this out." The two approached the waterbender, who grimaced a little and said, "Fire Nation." As he continued to play with the airball, Naruto turned to face the now approaching airbender and remarked, "Guess we can't avoid this, can we? Hey, Aang, it's time for you to see something." Completely uninformed, Aang kept moving forward. "Yeah? What?" In a moment of internal panic, Katara decided to bend some snow over Sokka and the dead, much to her brother's disapproval, as the young avatar was about to approach their position. At last, Aang arrived with a now perplexed Naruto and a composed Katara. He said, "So, what did you want to show me?" Katara chose to give the blonde the spotlight because she didn't plan this far ahead. She said, growing more anxious as she saw Naruto's shocked expression, "You and Naruto wanted to show you something awesome." "Really? What?" Aang looked at the shinobi and exclaimed. "Katara, what the hell?" Naruto thought as he quickly tried to come up with an idea. Naruto stammered, "Well, before his eyes revealed that he had made up his mind. "All right, here we go." Katara and Aang lost sight of Naruto as his body burst into a puff of smoke without any hesitation. The smoke took a few moments to clear, but when it did, Aang saw a full-length image of himself. "Tada!" Aang exclaimed with phony zeal. Aang walked around his double and exclaimed, "Whoa!" He had the perfect body in every way. The changed Naruto said, "Cool, right?" before swiftly displacing the henge and turning to face Aang. "How about we continue the tour, huh?" Aang nodded rapidly as he jolted out of his daze and began to move ahead of the others. Sokka's head emerged from the snow and gave Katara a slight glare as soon as Aang was out of earshot. He inquired, "What was that about?" "Yeah, Katara. I thought we would get this whole depressing revelation out of the way. Why did you hide this from him?" said Naruto. After giving it some thought, Katara appeared to follow the airbender. "I guess I'm just trying to help him keep his peace for as long as possible." As Naruto assisted Sokka to his feet, he replied, "You can't protect him forever." Naruto nodded in agreement. She continued to walk, saying, "I'll try for his sake." Naruto muttered to himself, "He's going to find out sooner or later." He then followed Sokka closely. Katara was still able to hear him. She said, "I know." After a brief period of silence, Naruto spoke once more. "A little heads up would have been nice earlier. I could have done something way more entertaining besides a simple transformation. I'm good on thinking on my feet, but I was preparing for the whole genocide of an entire culture thing," Naruto said as they were all walking side by one. "Simple?" Sokka replied, "People would kill to be able to do that. You're like the ultimate spy?" Naruto dismissed it with a shrug. "It becomes less glamorous after a while." The siblings shook their heads and kept walking down the path to catch up to the happy airbender for the time being. As they passed the main structures that comprised the temple, the remainder of the walk became increasingly fascinating. The group observed what they could presume to be the buildings where all of the airbenders slept, as well as training and meditation spaces and fountains. But it was a dismal sight, like everything else on the mountain. Everything was dead, dried out, and gray. The only sounds they could hear were Aang's constant explanations. As they continued to remind themselves of the terrible deeds committed a century ago, the Water Tribe natives and Naruto only occasionally displayed signs of curiosity. Unfortunately, Aang didn't seem to be thinking about that at all. Aang cheerfully exclaimed, "Hey guys, I want you to meet somebody," as they walked up to an ancient statue of one of the numerous monks who once roamed the grounds. "Who's that?" inquired Sokka. Aang bowed to his old master and grinned warmly, saying, "Monk Gyatso, the greatest airbender in the world. He taught me everything I know." The three people standing next to him observed as he appeared to look blankly into space. After a few uncomfortable moments, Katara approached him and placed her hand on his shoulder. "You must really miss him." Aang said, "Yeah," before passing the statue and entering the temple's main division's hallways. Without waiting for the three to react, he said, "Come on guys, the Air Temple Sanctuary is up ahead. There's somebody I'm ready to meet." The others exchanged bewildered glances, then shrugged and went along. They remained mostly silent as they went through the lengthy, deserted corridors, passing by numerous closed doors. Aang was waiting at the end of one hall when they finally arrived at a huge door with odd gadgets on it. Naruto examined the devices on the wooden door and said, "I'm assuming that's the door to the sanctuary?" Aang merely replied, "Yup." Sokka said, "Well, you got a key?" "The key, Sokka, is airbending," he said, grinning at his friends. Disregarding his friends' bewildered expressions, he moved away from them, inhaled deeply, and then blasted a stream of air from each palm into two tubes on the door's right and left sides. After that, the air moved along its assigned routes through the hollow wood, spinning and connecting several disconnected sections of the path to produce a distinctively toned whistle. Blue air symbols spun around, exposing their maroon sides one by one. The door creaked open and there was an audible click when every symbol was turned. From their vantage point, the group could only see total darkness in what appeared to be a sizable room. As he walked into the room, Aang's voice reverberated, "Hello? Anyone home?" As Naruto, Katara, and Sokka entered, he muttered to himself, "Who's supposed to be here?" Zuko has been having a terrible day. First, they had to dock at a Fire Nation naval yard for repairs due to the damage caused by that blonde bastard. The prince was annoyed because he could have been searching for his main target every second that was wasted here. In order to prevent Commander Zhao, who had just been promoted, from becoming suspicious and discovering the truth, he and his uncle then had to fabricate an explanation for the damages. Anyone with any fighting ability who was loyal to the Fire Nation would attempt to pursue the Avatar if word spread that he was still alive and that the enigmatic man they all knew as the Purple-Eyed Demon, or simply, Demon, was with him. Naturally, Zuko was unable to make that happen because he had already spent too much time looking for even the smallest clue as to where the Avatar might be. He couldn't afford any competition now that he was aiming for victory. Finally, and regrettably, his crew had to go and open their big mouths and ruin everything after barely escaping any revelation of the journey he had just gone through. Given that the crew likely felt they were given the short end of the stick by being assigned to the exiled member of the royal family for his voyage that had no chance of success, it wasn't shocking. As long as they obeyed his commands, Zuko didn't really care about their loyalty. However, he was disappointed when he demanded their complete devotion and silence. Consequently, he was forced to disclose everything. Every word he said felt like poison as he gave up this priceless knowledge. He was unable to look the commander in the eye the entire time, so he kept his head down in defeat and clenched his hands around the chair he was forced to sit in. After finishing his explanation, Zhao stood and looked impassively at the dishonored prince. The man with the striking sideburns and brown hair said, "So you're telling me that a 14-year-old boy is the Avatar and has the man that attacked the Southern Raiders as his companion?" Zuko nodded grimly. "And you and all of your genius thought that taking them both on would prove successful? How stupid are you?" Zhao went on. With a slight growl, Zuko answered, "I underestimated them. It won't happen again." "Oh, it definitely won't happen again, because you won't have a second chance," Zhao replied. Zuko turned to Zhao in protest, looking frightened. "Commander Zhao, I've been hunting the Avatar for 2 years and I..." As he hurled some fire in an arc above their heads, Zhao abruptly interrupted, saying, "And you failed." He calmed down a little and spoke again. "Obviously, capturing the Avatar and dealing with the so-called demon is too much for a mere teenager to handle. They're mine now. The only thing Zuko could do was leap from his seat and charge at Zhao, but the guards at the tent's entrance stopped him. As he left without turning around, Zhao gave the order, keep them here and don't let them out of your sight. After the respected commander departed, Zuko violently kicked the table they were using with fire enhancement, smashing it into pieces. His uncle Iroh was quietly watching this while sipping his favorite ginseng tea, which he had now finished. He respectfully asked one of the guards, more tea please. It took a few seconds for the four friends' eyes to get used to the dim lighting when they entered the large, dark room, but once they were able to see clearly, they were surrounded by a variety of perfectly arranged statues. They were arranged in a swirl pattern that traveled along the walls up the seemingly infinite number of stories above them and continued into the shadows. Every statue depicted a person with a variety of body types and attire, both male and female. They simply stood and watched as they passed a few rows of these strangers. Examining the statue beside her, Katara questioned, "Who are all these people?" Before turning his attention to the statue before him, he remarked, "I don't know, but I feel like I know them somehow." Aang exclaimed, "Look, there's an airbender," as he pointed to the sculpture of an elderly monk with the anticipated arrow tattoo on his bald head. "And this one's a waterbender," Katara claimed, pointing to the man wearing a headdress resembling a wolf. "They're lined up in a pattern, air, water, earth, then fire," she said. Aang continued, "That's the avatar cycle. Of course, these are all avatars. These are all your past lives, Aang," Katara replied. Aang approached a statue of an elderly man who appeared to be a native of the Fire Nation with a deeply captivated expression on his face. His eyes were drawn to the man, and he appeared to be in a trance until Katara shook him out of it, causing him to suddenly stand motionless. She said, "Who is that, Aang?" The airbender responded right away. "That's Avatar Roku, the avatar before me." "How did you know that? There isn't a nameplate or anything," Naruto replied. Aang answered, "I don't know, I just know it somehow." "Some avatar voodoo type stuff?" inquired Naruto. Aang laughed a little. "I guess it's something like that. I feel some sort of pull towards everyone here." Naruto gazed up at the far-off, shadowed ceiling and merely whistled in admiration. "Man, just from what we can see, there's thousands upon thousands of years that all of these people have lived. Damn, the Avatar is a bigger deal than I thought," Naruto replied quietly. There was a brief period of silence before Naruto, Katara, and Aang became alert due to a low growl that reverberated throughout the room. Naruto muttered, "The hell was that?" They were able to track the sound to their left as it grew louder. They all turned to look at Sokka's sullen face as he covered his stomach with a hand in perfect unison. Sokka said coldly to the blonde shinobi, "It's only been a couple of hours and I'm already considering cannibalism, Naruto. I'm glad all those years of training really developed you as an unstoppable warrior, Sokka," Naruto said, echoing Sokka's tone as the three of them stared at him blankly. They heard something move behind them before anyone could say anything more. They swiftly hid behind the closest statues after turning around and spotting an approaching shadow. Naruto and Katara were behind one, and Sokka and Aang were behind the other. Sokka turned to face the others while holding a club. He muttered, "Could be a firebender." Naruto heightened his senses to get a sense of what they were dealing with, but no one responded. Once he did, he relaxed immediately. He rolled his eyes, got out of his crouch, and walked calmly from behind his cover. The others gave him a perplexed and apprehensive look, but they soon followed his example. Everyone had left their hiding places when they noticed the unidentified intruder at the sanctuary's entrance. To their astonishment, a small lemur with brown and white wings stood curiously there, staring at them with wide green eyes. Aang's eyes glowed with intense excitement as it gave a little coo, tilted its head, and waved its brown tail with two white stripes. "Lemur!" he exclaimed with delight. It was, in fact, a lemur, one of the interesting animals that once lived on these old grounds. But the furry creature was the group's wolf-tailed warrior's next meal. With a desperate expression on his face and drool beginning to trickle from the corners of his mouth, Sokka said, "Dinner." A mocking murmur of, "Amazing willpower," came from Naruto. "Don't listen to Sokka, you're going to be my new pet," Aang replied. Declaring, "Not if I get him first," Sokka charged forward, shouting a battle cry, and dove for the creature. With a small, echoing cry of fear, the lemur quickly fled down the hall, getting on all fours, bristling its fur, and hissing at his assailant. Aang yelled, "Wait, come back," as he pursued. Sokka shouted, "I want to eat you," as she tried to follow the airbender. Katara stood next to an amused Naruto and asked, "Should we go after them?" As he began to leave with his hands behind his head, Naruto remarked nonchalantly, "I guess I'll track them down so nothing happens." I doubt anything bad will come out of it, but I'm pretty sure the animal is endangered and has a chance of becoming extinct if your carnivore of a brother gets his claws on it." In response, Katara teased, "Well, aren't you a regular forest ranger?" He shouted, "For nature," in jest, pumping his right fist into the air without turning around or slowing down. Katara chuckled a little before answering, "All right then, I'll see you in a little while. I want to look around a bit more." The blonde gave a little salute and walked away, saying, "Have fun." Who knew this would be the end of his day? He just wanted to enter, finish his repairs, and carry on with his travels. Unfortunately, he realized that any hopes he had for his desired plans were now dashed as he glanced across at the arrogant glare of the esteemed commander. Zhao had returned to the tent a few hours earlier to inform them that he and his uncle would be detained until the commander and his own warship and crew were at sea. The prince and the high-ranking member of their nation's naval forces exchanged words that were both mocking and challenging. There were always tensions, and Zhao had even mentioned Zuko's tender spot to his father, the Fire Lord. Zuko's outburst at the mere mention of that man is not surprising, especially when he is reminded of his entirely unwelcome presence back home. Because of this, he eventually gave in to his rage and essentially ordered his superior to engage in a firebender duel at sunset, known as an Agni Kai. He was well aware of the situation he was in. He continued to stare back at his opponent while unconsciously touching his facial scar because he was all too familiar with this situation. Zhao stood next to his recently abandoned ceremonial shoulder garment on the ground, dressed only in loose, dark pants and thin armbands, and said indifferently, "I expect this to be quick, so let's get this over with." Wearing a similar outfit and a discarded garment, Zuko glared intently and said, "Think what you want, but I will not let you win." From behind his nephew, Iroh said, "Remember your firebending basics, Prince Zuko. They're your greatest weapons." The two fighters just stared at each other for a moment. They sensed the tension in the air and were prepared to take action at any time, as were the few onlookers who were watching this event. Zuko hurried into action when a gong suddenly rang out loudly. He punched out a tiny stream of flame from his outstretched fist. The commander sidestepped the fire before it went out behind him, easily avoiding the attack that was headed for Zhao. Zuko took a quick breath of exasperation and fired another, but the outcome was the same. Zhao dodged fire after fire with ease and even grinned a little. As the assault persisted, Zhao made the decision to push himself a little and confronted Zuko's flames by knocking them out and even shooting his own torching stream into Zuko's, encircling his unharmed body in a roaring shroud of orange and red. Zhao launched an offensive while grinning smugly. Taking a deep breath, the older firebender blasted a larger ball of fire than had been seen before and approached the young prince. Zuko was a little exhausted from starting his earlier attacks, so his only option was to confront the flames and do his best to block them. He was only knocked back a few feet by the first attack shot, and the second and third attacks had the same effect. Zhao's fourth shot caused Zuko to let his guard down just enough for the lethal flames to send him skidding backward on the merciless earth. Zuko tried to sit back up with a moan of pain, but his eyes widened in alarm as he saw Zhao, who was now in the air, before he landed hard in front of him. Zhao immediately struck out with his fist, igniting a flame in an attempt to burn Zuko and put an end to the altercation. After dazedly staring at the flaming fire, Zuko regained his composure and swiftly spun around, sweeping his legs directly into Zhao's, who now had a shocked expression on his face, before collapsing back onto the ground in Zuko's original position. Zuko smirked as he gained the upper hand, now standing and having escaped Zhao's blow. Zhao quickly stood up after realizing this, but Zuko took advantage of his weakness and he was unable to position himself to defend himself. As he moved closer to his adversary, the prince slid his feet across the ground, releasing waves of fire. Zuko continued to fire with every step, throwing Zhao off balance and forcing him to retreat helplessly. In an effort to put a swift end to this, Zuko moved close and delivered a series of kicks of fire that Zhao attempted to block or avoid but was ultimately knocked back by a final kick that sent the commander rolling backwards onto the ground. Zhao, dazed now, could only look up to see Zuko staring down at him, his fist out, ready to launch a last-ditch assault. "Do it," commanded Zhao. As he continued to gaze thoughtfully down at his vanquished opponent, Zuko swung his fist forward and unleashed a deadly burst of fire that struck the ground directly next to Zhao's head. When Zhao realized what the prince had done, he remarked, "That's it, your father raised a coward." He retreated and began to approach his uncle, but Zuko seemed to dismiss him. "I promise the next time you get in my way, I won't hold back," he replied. Zhao developed an enraged snarl as Zuko walked, then rose and charged at the young firebender with the intention of delivering a devastating blow with a fire-filled kick. Zhao was about to make contact with his attack when he was stopped and his fire was extinguished. When he looked up, He saw that Iroh had a firm hold on his bare foot. Then, with a single flick of his wrist, he was unexpectedly thrown back. Zuko snarled in rage as he realized the cheap shot he was about to receive and attempted to attack Zhao once more, but his uncle stopped him. Iroh looked down at Zhao and said, "No, Prince Zuko. Do not taint your victory. So this is how the great Commander Zhao acts in defeat. Disgraceful. Even in exile, my nephew is more honorable than you." Zuko gave his uncle a startled glance before continuing. Iroh said, "Thank you again for the tea, it was delicious," and turned to leave the big, deserted arena. "Did you really mean that, uncle?" Zuko whispered, catching up to him quickly. All Iroh got was a tiny, cunning smile. "Of course, like I told you earlier, ginseng tea is my favorite." Before moving on to their makeshift quarters to wait for their ship to be fixed, Zuko merely gave his uncle a blank stare. After pursuing the lemur for almost an hour, Aang was evaded more times than he would like to acknowledge. His repeated attempts to attack the tiny creature were unsuccessful, and occasionally he was unable to locate it. Now that he was at the foot of one of the numerous stone staircases, he was fortunate enough to spot the lemur sprinting past an ancient, torn tarp that served as the entrance to a nearly entirely demolished and dilapidated structure. Aang pushed the tarp aside and went inside, saying, "Come on out, little guy. That hungry man won't bother you anymore." But what he saw inside would be ingrained in his memory for all time. He muttered to himself, "Firebenders? They were here?" As he looked around the open space, which was populated by many skeletons, all of whom were dressed in tattered and worn red armor. What lay at the end of the trail of the fallen Fire Nation soldiers was far worse than that. A skeleton, buried waist, deep in snow, stood at the end of the grotto, but it was the traditional air nomad robes that set this skeleton apart. A closer look revealed a unique necklace that Aang could never have missed around the deceased person's neck. Aang said, "Gyatsoa," with glistening eyes and a sense of shock rising inside him. He collapsed to his knees, covering his quickly watering eyes with his hands, and began to sob a few times in despair. The curtain behind him was drawn back to reveal Sokka. "Aang, you here?" he asked, then looked down to see his friend in tears. "Aang, I wasn't really going to eat the..." He paused and looked twice at Gyatso's corpse. Sokka mumbled, "Oh Mana," before approaching the airbender and putting a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Aang, everything will be all right. Let's get out of here." Aang's tattoos began to glow a familiar and spiritual blue instead of responding. When Avatar Roku's eyes began to glow blue, Katara was still examining the statues with interest. In a moment of mild surprise, she realized that all of the previous avatars were experiencing the same thing, and she saw the humming radiance of cerulean spread out quickly up into the ceiling. "Aang!" she exclaimed, then bolted for the door to see what was wrong with her friend. This phenomenon was occurring elsewhere in the world besides the Southern Air Temple. Spiritual temples in the Fire Nation, Northern Water Tribe, and Earth Kingdom all glowed with spiritual energy in response to Aang's power. One of the distressed sages in the Fire Nation found another to deliver his message. As the other responded in kind, he exclaimed in terror, "Send word to the Fire Lord immediately. The Avatara has returned." Naruto continued to stroll calmly around, searching for his ecstatic friends. But he was not in a hurry. He was naturally inclined to complete tasks quickly, but for a while he just wanted to relax. He was certain that the lemur would not be harmed. Otherwise, Aang would simply use concentrated wind to blast Sokka away. Despite his carnivorous nature, he hoped Sokka would be wise enough to avoid that since he knew he wouldn't want it. Naruto continued to gaze around the formerly affluent community while playing with some pebbles floating above his palm and whistling a slow tune to himself. Occasionally, he would discover the skeleton of a firebender or airbender and send a clone to collect them for a proper burial or possibly cremation, depending on what Aang thought was appropriate for a later time. Even though he appeared composed, Naruto couldn't help but feel depressed each time he discovered more traces of the people who once called this place home. He was grateful that Aang stayed on the somewhat pristine main path and avoided going inside the numerous dilapidated buildings, as he had already lost count of the number of them he had found and gathered. Although he was accustomed to seeing things like this, he always felt sorry for people who didn't deserve it and had much more potential in life. Every time he discovered remains that appeared too small to belong to adults, his chest ached even more. Kids still had their entire lives ahead of them. There were so many things they could have done, places they could have been, people they could have met, families they could have started, etc. Perhaps I arrived at the wrong time. He shook his head after giving it some thought. He had to work to ensure that tragedies like this one didn't occur again because there was nothing else he could do. Aang said that this particular temple was only for male air nomads, so the only silver lining was that thankfully there wasn't a nursery here. He didn't want to add to the already depressing experience of discovering all these bodies by having to bury the particularly young. However, this was only one temple, and he could only speculate as to how many people were slaughtered at the others. He stomped the head of a Fire Nation soldier into the dust at this thought. He muttered angrily, "Fuckers were lucky I wasn't Haria," before creating a second clone to collect the remaining bastard and carrying him to a previously discovered, deserted courtyard reserved for the firebenders. Before he sighed and carried on, Naruto had long since stopped whistling and let the tiny pebbles drop to the ground. He saw an explosion in the distance after just a few more steps. Although he couldn't really see what was happening, he concentrated a little more and noticed that the wind in the area was erratic and getting stronger. "Aang! Shit!" he exclaimed, then leapt to the roof of an old building and fled as quickly as he could. Sokka was unaware of what was happening. He was attempting to console Aang when he noticed that his tattoos were glowing, and then he was struck by a strong wind gust and smashed back into a wall. "That must be how it feels to be tackled by a paw," Sokka moaned as he looked over some debris and sat back up from his grounded position. In a huge ball of spinning air, he saw an Aang floating magically with his back tuned to him. Even now, his tattoos were still gleaming with power, and Sokka couldn't help but feel cold just being around Aang. "What should I do? When you need Naruto, where is he?" In a panic, he thought. He reasoned that he might as well try talking as the seconds passed. He yelled frantically, "Aang, calm down, you got to snap out of it," at him. He didn't hear back. Behind him, he heard what happened. Sokka looked back and saw his younger sister move behind his present cover to stand beside him. He yelled back, he just found out firebenders killed Gyatso and went nuts, over the wind's loud whistling. Glancing at Aang, Katara saw the same blue glow that she had seen in the sanctuary moments before and when she first met the young airbender. "It's his avatar spirit, he must have triggered it," she screamed. "Is that what's going on?" the two siblings asked, turning to face the new voice. Sokka said, "Oh, hey Naruto. Glad you can make it. Do you mind making sure Baldy over there doesn't kill us?" to the shinobi who had just arrived and was fixed on Aang. "What do you expect me to do? I'm not an expert on this crap," Naruto shot back. "I thought you took him out of the village back at the South Pole that one night so you could be ready if he went out of control," Sokka replied. "Doesn't mean I had a plan. The most I could come up with at the time was to knock him out." The fighter frantically looked around him and yelled, "Then do that. You need to. Where's Katara?" Naruto also scanned his surroundings before focusing on the water tribe girl who was slowly approaching the uncontrollably aggressive avatar. Sokka also saw Katara and exclaimed, "Crap! Katara! Get back here right now. It might be too dangerous." She didn't acknowledge what her brother had said. Naruto yelled to Sokka, "I guess we're going in too," as he began to move in Katara's direction. "What? But isn't it?" "Aw, forget it," Sokka exclaimed as he followed Naruto's lead and continued to walk. As the two men approached Katara's position behind a partially collapsed wall, they began to hear her attempting to soothe Aang. "Aang, I know that you're upset and I know how hard it is to lose the people you love. I felt the same when I thought I lost my mom. It didn't last long, but I remember feeling completely helpless and thought everything was ruined and couldn't be fixed. It was like my heart was ripped out. You don't have to go through that alone because you still have a family. Naruto, Sokka, and we're your family now." Naruto shouted, "Listen to her, Arrowhead," as he and Sokka eventually arrived beside her. Naruto gripped his stomach, which felt like it was going to be torn out of his body, and sounded out, "We all have to face loss sometimes, and, while not on this scale, everyone goes through it. You act." "What the hell?" the blonde thought frantically. He simply attempted to manage the pain for the time being and continue assisting Aang, but before he could do so, he noticed insignificant streams of blue energy shoot into his seal, which he had had all his life. He talked on, momentarily ignoring the new disruption. "Why you just have to stay strong and move on. You have to at least try, if not for you then for those that you loved. They wouldn't want to see you like this and you know damn well that I know what you're going through because I had to face the same thing." Naruto yelled as he felt the pressure in his stomach get worse. The crazy winds subsided and vanished as Aang began to float back down, his eyes and tattoos still glowing, as if that had finally had the desired effect. The other three approached and surrounded him as he fell back to the ground. Sokka said softly, "We promise that we won't allow anything to happen to you anymore." After the young man finished speaking, Katara reassured Aang by squeezing his hand, and Sokka and Naruto supported him by placing a hand on both of his shoulders. Aang's tattoos and glowing eyes eventually returned to their usual brightness before he collapsed once more from emotional and physical exhaustion. Fortunately, the other three managed to catch him and knelt down to remain near him. Softly, Aang said. I'm sorry. Katara calmly answered, it's not your fault. Aang's expression abruptly became even more dejected. But you were right, and if the firebenders found this temple, then that means they found the others too. I really am the last airbendera. For a short while, everyone just held him in silence while casting a sorrowful glance down at him. They might not have realized they had been out there for hours. They simply remained where they were to give Aang some peace, but that had to end eventually. But things didn't turn out the way they had hoped. When Naruto groaned in pain and began to perspire a little while holding a hand over his midsection, Aang, Katara, and Sokka jumped in a little panic. Aang whispered, "Are you okay, Naruto?" With a strained laugh, Naruto said, "Already worrying about your family, Aang? Don't worry about me. Your brother Naruto just needs to take some antacids or something. You're going to need more than that, dumbass." A voice that Naruto had heard before shot into his mind. "Kurama, where the hell have you been, you damn furball?" Naruto yelled in his head. "I thought a month. Long nap was in order after surviving a war, but that's not the point," replied the fox. "Then what are you going on about?" "This," Kurama said, seemingly pointing to something. "I can't see what you're pointing at, you." "Ha ha 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 ha, I'm back," exclaimed a fresh voice with insane delight. His friends noticed that Naruto froze and that his eyes widened. "Naruto?" Katara worriedly called out to him. Nervously, Naruto answered, "Tease nothing, don't worry about me." Naruto cried inwardly, "What's going on? What's going on is that out of fucking nowhere the mindscape started having an earthquake and a bunch of dirt started picking up in some sort of tornado. Then the crazy sounding voice kept laughing, saying, "Then I showed up. That must mean I'm alive. Nothing can stop me. I'm back for good, baby." Kurama retorted, "Will you shut up, you crazy tanuki? Wait a Shukaku." "You're damn right," exclaimed the one-tailed beast. "But how are? Wait, screw it, I'll deal with this later. Don't cut the link. Don't leave me with this psychotic son of a." Naruto refused to comply. "Naruto!" Katara exclaimed, jolting the shinobi from his brief reverie. "Huh?" he asked. Sokka responded, "She asked, are you sure you're alright?" He thought, or tenants now. "Yeah, just kind of had a small conversation with my tenant." After a brief moment of confusion, the three others understood what he was saying and nodded. Concerned, Katara said, "Okay then, but if something's wrong, you better let us know." With a tentative thumbs up and a sheepish smile, Naruto said, "Yeah, you got it." The southern air temple's mountain ranges were now getting close to dusk, and everything was silent. Naruto and Aang discussed how to deal with the remnants of his people a few hours earlier, once things had settled down. Aang was uncomfortable talking about it, but he knew it had to be done. It turns out that generations of people who had come before him were finally laid to rest at an underground burial site accessible from an entrance at the back of the sanctuary. Naruto was quite impressed when he first stepped inside. After descending the lengthy staircase, all he could do was watch as he sent dozens of clones into the dark depths, each one guiding itself with its tiny flames above its palms. If they saw torches hanging on the wall, they would light them and light up the surrounding areas. Hundreds of torches were lit, and it seemed like they would never go out. The meticulously constructed routes seemed to go on forever into the mountain. He was unsure if earthbenders had assisted in building the location, but even if they had, building such a large crypt would still be a challenging undertaking. After some time, Naruto's clones informed him that they had discovered a sizable open space where the air nomads had left off. Naruto started working at that point. When he returned to the surface, he created more clones after dispelling the remaining ones that were in the burial site. Then, using blankets he discovered in what he believed to be a storage building, these clones wrapped each skeleton and other remnant of the air nomads that they had previously collected. The cage buncheons carried them into the enormous tomb one by one, and they made their way to the large, deserted room they discovered. Aang, Katara, and Sokka stood silently by the burial site's entrance, keeping their heads bowed in reverence until the final clone descended the stairs. They followed the original Naruto's instructions to follow him and his clones. It was a very quiet and unsettling walk that seemed to go on for hours. Naruto reasoned that having to pass a seemingly infinite number of corpses in different locations along the walls and in the ground made it difficult to feel at ease. Aang found it particularly difficult because he appeared to be focusing on each member of the family that was part of his culture. He had to constantly keep his composure and occasionally wipe away a few tears that were escaping. When they eventually arrived at their destination, they discovered that the clones had almost finished the preparations. With the aid of earthbending, the group observed that the previously empty chamber had been transformed into a suitable burial ground and was well lit by torches. To make up for the enormous number of dead, hundreds of respectable sized holes were dug in the ground along the far end of the chamber, and slots were carved into the walls. They could all see that it was neatly set up and had enough room for everyone. But in the center of the room, leaning against the wall, was a stone coffin, encircled by those in the walls and the ground. The most visible feature on the front side of the coffin was a wooden necklace that was securely embedded in the stone. Aang recognized it right away, and when he saw the engraving, which only said Gyatso before the group watched as the clones completed placing the remaining dead in their proper locations, Aang had silently thanked Naruto. Once everyone was safely positioned, the clones all planted their feet in the ground at once, and then they quickly pushed forward with their arms to cover all of the skeletal remains with gravel and dirt that was tightly backed. They even succeeded in implanting the Air Nomad's emblem directly into the walls where the individuals were positioned. The same was done for the deceased, who were given small memorial stones with the same emblem embedded in the ground above them. Once more, they lowered their heads for a short while and offered silent prayers for everyone before rising again. While traveling, Naruto and Aang would use a slight wind gust to put out any torches they came across. They sealed off the entrance and left the sanctuary after they eventually reached the surface. The winged lemur from earlier was waiting for them all, which was an interesting thing that happened after they closed the enormous doors. When the tiny creature dropped some fruit in front of Sokka, which he happily ate before climbing onto the airbender's shoulders, Aang's eyes brightened with joy once more. The lemur was lovingly named Momo by Aang, who proclaimed him a new member of their family. Then, since he also needed to get rid of the Fire Nation soldiers, Naruto broke away from the others. Naruto went to the pile of firebenders in the courtyard. He discovered and ignited them with a strong stream of fire while the others went to set up a small place for them to spend the night. He thought that since they were being buried in the midst of their country's element, it seemed appropriate. When there were only heaps of ashes remaining, he threw a powerful gust of wind into the pile and saw the remnants of the invaders from a century ago float off into the distance in the direction of the limitless mountains. Then, with a blank expression, he turned around and walked silently toward his friends. The group is currently located here. As the siblings gathered around a cozy fire at their campsite, Naruto called out to them, "It's done." They were located close to the edge of a nearby cliff face with a view of the entire Patola Mountains, in an empty area of weeds and dead grass. After glancing at Naruto, Katara and Sokka simply nodded before settling back into their comfortable positions. The blonde said, "Where's Aang?" Sokka replied. Sokka pointed to his left and said, "He took Appa and Momo and went towards the edge of the cliff over there." Naruto squinted because of the distant setting sun as he looked where Sokka had indicated. After some acclimatization, Naruto finally saw the silhouettes of a standing Aang and his two animal companions, Momo safely resting on his right shoulder and Appa lying down to Aang's left. After giving it some thought, Naruto made the decision to approach the young avatar. As Aang approached, Naruto heard him say, "We're all that's left of this place," and he said, "You guys, Katara, Sokka, and Naruto, we have to stick together." When Naruto announced his arrival, he asked, "Mention me." Aang smiled slightly as he turned around. "Oh, hey Naruto." Appa, Momo, and Aang all stared into the distant sunset as Naruto calmly strolled beside them without answering. To put it mildly, it was a sight to remember. The mountains and the lovely cloudy sky were covered in abstract hues of orange, red, yellow, and pink. To immerse oneself in the aura that this magnificent act of nature created, one only needed to pause and admire its beauty for a brief moment. To enjoy as much as possible, the four of them just stood and relaxed. But after a while, Naruto made the decision to speak up. Without turning to face his friend, Naruto inquired, "How are you holding up?" After a brief period of silence, Aang sighed and followed Naruto's lead by sitting cross-legged. "I'm not sure exactly how I feel. I know I'm sad, but there just seems to be so much Morea. It's like there's a part of me that just can't accept that this happened while another wants to push forward. It's like I'm just sort of stuck. I just don't know what I should do." He said this while continuing to gaze into the distance. Naruto gave a nod. This reminded him of the first night he realized exactly what had happened following his fight with Kaguya. Naruto muttered, "I know the feeling." Aang turned to the shinobi and appeared to become more vigilant. "Actually, as strange as it may sound, I'm kind of glad that there is someone to relate to me on this even though the situations are massively different. Is that wrong?" Aang responded. Naruto chuckled quietly to himself. "It isn't, so don't worry about it. It might seem weird, but even instances like this can bring people closer together." Aang grinned appreciatively as soon as he thought about his new family. Yeah. For a few minutes, they fell silent and gazed at the mountains once more. But Naruto made the decision to say one final thing before the sun finally set. As Aang turned to face the blonde, Naruto began, "Take it from me, Arrowhead. Over the years I've come to learn something very important. Aang only paid closer attention when Naruto paused. When we hit our lowest point, we are open to the greatest change. The stars began to appear in all their blinking glory as the sun finally set and shadows enveloped them all. With the exception of the soft winds and whistling, the surroundings were silent. Even though there were dark days, it seemed that there was always a bright future to look forward to. The scenery was the same as it had been since he first learned how to truly take charge of his thoughts. The unspoiled beaches and flawless grass plains stretched endlessly from left to right, and the view of the ocean was stunning. A hint of a potential downpour and the natural scent of salty air were carried into his nostrils by the gentle breeze. Because the sun's bright light was mostly obscured by white and gray clouds, he was able to see clearly and unhindered, though a few majestic rays were able to peek, in godlike grandeur, onto the world below. Overall, he could honestly describe it as his happy place. This could only get even more peaceful if he had a steaming bowl of the ramen he grew up eating and then took a nice, restful nap. Unfortunately, though, this was not the moment to appreciate his mindscape. Behind Naruto, a deep voice said, "It's about damn time." When the blonde shinobi turned around, the fox was lying on its haunches with a red eye peeking out from between two powerful tails that were all aimed at suffocating Kurama's head. Naruto calmly said, "Well, sorry, I just got to sleep and Uma, what are you doing?" Kurama answered, sitting up and removing all of its tails from its face. "What I'm doing is trying to tune out the actions of my mentally incompetent sibling." Speaking of Shukaku, where is the tanuki anyway? Give it a second, Kurama said without emotion. Give wa. Naruto started, but the ground beneath him began to tremble violently. Naruto yelled, "The hell is that bastard doing?" as he struggled to remain standing. Kurama simply gestured to the mass forest of abnormally tall trees behind it with one of its tails. After regaining his balance, Naruto turned to face the group of trees he had planted to serve as Kurama's natural habitat. There was plenty of space for the fox to run around and do whatever it pleased because the trees were too big to match its stature. If not for the enormous trail of broken foliage that stretched off into the distance, it would have been the magnificent sight it has always been. It was a nice gesture after the ice was broken between the two of them all those years ago. Kurama gave Naruto a deadpan look and a slight nod as he looked up and pointed haltingly to the trail. Naruto said, "Right, care to give me a lift?" The fox lowered its head and rolled its eyes. "Just get on." Before they followed the trail of devastation Shukaku left behind, Naruto nodded and leapt onto his partner's head. Rock formations were nearly reduced to dust, trees were toppled, and insane laughter could be heard for miles around. While knocking down some more trees that, to its slight confusion, were the same size as its enormous body, the one-tailed tanuki shouted into the sky, "It's great to be out and about again. The air is fresh, the day is young, and there's so much to destroy. It's a shame there hasn't been anything to kill for fun, but might as well enjoy the moment." It didn't really question it. All the great sand manipulator wanted was to relish the fact that it was at last free and could do as it pleased. With its enormous tail, claws, and wind jutsus, it was destroying everything it could and enjoying every moment of it. The world was open to you without having to worry about fighting a war or being captured. Naruto and Kurama eventually arrived on the scene after Shukaku had damaged the side of another mountain. Naruto sat on his Biju's head and said, "Shouldn't Shukaku realize that we aren't anywhere near the battlefield or even in the elemental nations at all anymore?" Kurama laughed. "You're stupid if you think Shukaku is anything but stupid." Naruto gave his first tenant a gentle glare. What exactly happened when Shukaku showed up, anyway? The psycho formed out of nowhere, looked at me and screamed about being free, screamed to you not realizing you weren't physically around, then ran off and continued to yell out while destroying everything along the way. Kurama responded. Naruto's expression went blank. As he and Kurama drew nearer, Naruto remarked, "Sounds about right. Unfortunately. Well, let's get going." Shukaku was not paying enough attention to its surroundings. They only needed to travel for a few more minutes to reach their target at a suitable distance. Naruto shouted, "1 sucks compared to 9. With a chakra-enhanced voice, obviously trying to get Shukaku's attention. Shukaku slowly turned its head toward the newcomers behind it as a powerful claw in mid-swing abruptly stopped and the temperature grew colder and more intense. With a lethal glare, the tanuki roared, "Can you run that by me again?" Kurama pointed its cranium's eyes at his container. The fox said gravely, "Don't get the bastard riled up. I don't want to deal with this crap right now." Naruto pouted a little, but he quickly got over it. He addressed the sand demon once more after saying, "You're no fun." He yelled, "Never mind what I said, we need to talk." "And what is so important that you have to ruin my fun?" Why aren't you celebrating, really? Look at us, we're all still here, so why don't you ruin things with me? At least until something that we can kill appears. Naruto whispered to himself, to think, this big bundle of crazy was so calm and cooperative the last time we met. Just be grateful that we aren't being attacked right now, Kurama said. Before turning up the volume once more, Naruto answered, whatever. Shukaku, where are we at this moment? After scratching its chin and looking around a few times, the beast appeared to consider the question before turning to face the two. A woodland? While that isn't totally incorrect, is this a forest where you've been at any point in your life? Naruto sighed, suppressing the urge to smack himself on the forehead. Take a look around. Where in the elemental nations are there trees your size? Shukaku simply appeared to look around even more and developed a bewildered expression. Kurama shouted, oh, for the love of. We're in the Gaki's head, Shukaku, without holding back. The Tanuki froze and kept looking at Kurama and Naruto. Shukaku spoke again in one of his rare moments of clarity. So you mean he's, Kurama cut in, yes, and I'm. This time, Naruto interrupted, pretty much. Shukaku simply grunted to itself and appeared to be giving it more thought before idly sitting on its rear, making the ground tremble once more and maintaining its balance with the aid of its feet and tail. The Ichibi would resemble a pouting child who has just been informed that he is in timeout if it weren't for its distinctive features. Naruto remarked, this is turning out calmer than I expected. Kurama remained silent while they awaited the thoughtful Biju's response. At last, Shukaku uttered, how did this happen? I thought we'd all be free once we left the statue. The Ichibi's serenity seemed to startle the pair a little, but they quickly recovered. Well, began Naruto, I'm not exactly sure. At the end of the fight when you all gave me a small piece of your chakra, I thought that would only be a one-time deal, but I guess it wasn't. During Kaguya's sealing I remember absorbing all kinds of energy, but I wasn't able to clearly identify them properly with everything going on. I'm no genius, but I think the ghetto statue must have given out and somehow all of you and your siblings might have been drawn to your wills that you lent to me and were absorbed along with everything else. I'm going to have to agree with you on that one, Kurama responded. Naruto said, really? Kurama gave a small nod, yeah, you're definitely not a genius. To be seen, Naruto scuttled up to one of Kurama's eyes and gave him a simple, flip off, before moving back to his starting point. In all seriousness, though, I guess that's all we can go off of for now. If your little theory is true, then that means everyone else is in a dormant state for some reason. When I came back, I felt their chakra, so I thought they were all here, but I had to have Naruto confirm what was going on, and even then we weren't really focusing on the issue until now. Kurama continued. Naruto muttered to himself, if you hadn't had to take your stupid nap, we would have talked it out. Kurama listened, but showed no interest. Shukaku calmly said, then how did I come back? Before we can answer that, you have to understand something first, said Naruto. Shukaku said, what? Naruto sheepishly exclaimed, we Yuha Sword Akinda went to a different dimension with a whole new culture and stuffa. Shukaku looked down and fell silent again. Shukaku turned back to its focus and said, oh yeah, and a couple more things. It's been around 8 years since the war ended and I got some Yuha improvements in my vision which can be explained later by Kurama or you can just go ahead and look through some memories. Now then, you managed to reappear here earlier because I absorbed some energy called Kai from a new friend who is a bit special in this new world. This will also be explained later, but anyway, from what I can tell, this Kai is allowing you guys to come back. The reason why, I'm not entirely sure, but I'll try to figure this all out as I go along. And there's no way to get back to Suna or the elemental nations at all? Asked Shukaku. At that point, Naruto appeared somewhat dejected. I doubt the Kamui can help, too, Naruto thought. No, I have no idea how to create dimensions like Kaguya. I just don't know how she did it or if I'm even capable of it. It's beyond my skills at the moment. He may have messed around with his new skills, but that doesn't mean he was an expert. Even though he learned a lot during Kaguya's sealing, it didn't seem like it would help him return home. Kaguya was fairly certain that all of those other worlds opening up was the product of unbridled power and bad luck because his chakra had been going crazy back in the volcano dimension. Why didn't she take advantage of those worlds if she could have accessed them earlier? It would have been more difficult for him and the other members of Team 7 to deal with an inhabited world where they could have been dropped, wouldn't it? I see. So now what? Requested Shukaku. I'm not sure. I'm working on ending another war, so there's that. Kurama here most likely wants to sleep and relax as much as possible since there is pretty much no worry of you guys being in danger anymore. The Tanuki asked, and me? Naruto hesitated. Well, what is it that you want to do? A tiny, twisted smile appeared on Shukaku's face, and its eyes were filled with bloodlust. I want to kill, maim, destroy, and blah blah blah. I really should have already known that. Naruto responded. Shukaku only gave him an enthusiastic nod. Well, I'm not going to go around killing people, and you bet your ass all of that kill for mother mumbo jumbo isn't going to work here. Even if you tried, I can just mute you out and trap you in chains or something so you can't give me a migraine. Shukaku scowled and appeared prepared to act, but Naruto spoke once more. However, I can give you this instead. Although neither Kurama nor Shukaku knew what to anticipate, Naruto demonstrated exactly what he meant by closing his eyes in concentration while Kurama waited and Shukaku watched. The scene directly behind Shukaku began to change in less than a minute. Sand began to replace dirt and gravel, buildings began to form out of the same material and solidify to remain in place, and other landmarks like parks with playground necessities were created. Shukaku was very interested in all of this. Its other Jinchuriki were unable to create mindscapes with such inventiveness. An endless desert of sand was the most it could experience, but that was all. However, Naruto was free to create anything his imagination could conjure up here. Shukaku now understood that this was the blonde's territory. He was undoubtedly able to do so without hesitation when Naruto threatened to chain him down if he attempted to cause trouble. Even so, it was experiencing true happiness as the building went on. It resembled Suna more and more as each building came into being. But since this was the place where it was compelled to be imprisoned like a prisoner for many years, this wasn't happiness from nostalgia. The memories of being confined to a sealed jail cell were not forgotten, even if relations between it and Gaara were resolved close to the end of the war. No, the true purpose of this construction was this increasing joy. The absence of a human population was a minor source of disappointment, but it wasn't a major concern. When the final structures, such as the cage tower, were completed, Shukaku approached the village it was familiar with and surveyed everything from above with a calculating gaze. Still perched atop Kurama's head, Naruto questioned, "Did I get it right?" After shifting its gaze over the entire village for a few moments, Shukaku finally allowed a tiny smile to appear with a certain sparkle in its eyes. Naruto needed no more confirmation than that. The Ichibi gave Naruto a curious look before pointing down to the village with a single finger. Naruto nodded, having a decent idea of what Shukaku intended to do. Go ahead and be his bat. Shit crazy as you want. It should regenerate every hour or so. Consider this place your own little part of my mind. Shukaku's smile turned bloodthirsty as it nodded back and turned to face the cage tower. With a powerful right hook, it destroyed a large portion of it, scattering dust and debris in the process. Well, looks like the psycho found a permanent pastime. You do realize I'm not going to get any peace, right? Naruto responded. Don't worry about it. I'll just put some sound barrier or something so you won't be disturbed. It's my mind, so I can do whatever I want, he replied. Kurama acknowledged with a grunt. Well, I guess we're done here for now. Just let Shukaku destroy crap and you can go back to the other side of the forest or near the shore. It should be about time for me to wake up soon anyway. Might as well be an early bird. Naruto replied. Alright then, as long as I'm not disturbed. One more thing before you go, though, the fox replied. Yeah? Naruto seemed to be getting ready to go. What about the toads? Haven't you tried to reverse summon or something? Naruto questioned, didn't I tell you to go through my memories? Well, yeah, but I figured I'd do that later, but old Sandy and Psycho over there interrupted before I could. The blonde sighed slightly and cast a sidelong glance with a hint of melancholy. Of course I've tried, but it just doesn't work. I'm not an expert on this whole dimensional travel thing. But maybe Mount Mayaboku is probably only unique to the dimension of the elemental nations. Maybe by being here the contract doesn't work. I don't have the faintest idea of what's exactly happening, but I know the toads are going to be a no-show for a long time, if not forever. I miss them just as much as everyone else. Naruto smiled with a bittersweet grin. Kurama remained quiet for a while until Naruto resumed his speech. I think I've spent enough time here, so I guess I'll start getting ready for the day with the others, he concluded. Alright. I'll relax and go through your memories to find out what's been going on. I've been curious about that new group you're with. As Kurama gave a small nod, Naruto remarked, oh, their names are Aang, Katara, and Sokka. You can find out more when you go through my memories, though. See ya later then, bunny ears. A violent swat of an orange tail instantly flicked Naruto off the Kyuubi's head, just as it had done numerous times in their argumentative antics. Naruto shouted, I regret nothing. As his body shot hundreds of feet into the air. His voice reverberated for a moment before his body vanished from the mindscape just before he reached the tree line. As it started to return to its designated resting place, Kurama grinned slightly. That always feels good. Naruto asked his friends, is everything packed? As he examined Appa's saddle, Sokka said, I'm pretty sure we have everything covered. After arriving at the Southern Air Temple and attending Naruto's Mindscape meeting, the group was prepared to continue their journey the following morning. From his position on Appa's head, Aang said, are you guys sure that we should be leaving already? It seems a little weird to only be here a day. I don't see why not. We explored most of the place yesterday and I get the feeling that we, especially you, need to clear our heads after that little spiritual episode. Naruto said while assisting Sokka. Sitting calmly on the saddle and holding a slumbering Momo in her lap, Katara began, he's right, Aang. It took you hours to fall asleep, and even then it was because Naruto used an illusion on you. A little traveling should relax you. Aang appeared to argue, but he soon gave in. Fine. I guess some flying will help, he replied. After completing his preparations, Naruto remarked, and it's not like we'll be gone forever. We can stop by here whenever we want. How? Asked Aang. Naruto said, remember this. As a tri-pronged kunai materialized in his hand. The airbender said, I think so. That's the teleportee thing, right? Naruto clarified, Hiraishin kunai, adding, and it's with this awesome weapon that we can come back anytime. The shinobi finished, then flicked his wrist to send the kunai flying. 50 yards from where they were, the lethal fragment of chakra. Conducted metal whistled through the air for a brief moment before striking deeply into the trunk of a massive tree that was both ancient and enormous. The tree stood in the center of an old, dilapidated garden close to where they had spent the previous night camping. Naruto placed his hand on Sokka's shoulder and said, observe. He and Naruto vanished in a flash of yellow before the Water Tribe native could react. Aang marveled at what he saw. Even though he recalled Naruto employing this method in the Tsukuyomi, witnessing it firsthand with all of his attention was quite different. Sokka's voice called out from the tree embedded with kunai, warn me the next time you do that. Aang and a completely composed Katara looked at the distant male pair. Naruto questioned, you still don't get queasy, do you? No, but surprising me like that just might make me sick like the first time, replied Sokka. Katara made a little grimace and said absently, that was a nasty day. Aang looked at the waterbender and said, have you teleported before? Katara grinned while nodding. Plenty of times. The first time really gave me a stomachache, but it passed quickly and all the times after that were all fine and really fun. Naruto surprised the airbender once more by appearing next to them in a shunshin, and they heard him say, whatever, let's just get going. Katara appeared unaffected. Sokka, hurry up, we're losing daylight, Naruto screamed. After complaining to himself, the young warrior strode over to his companions. Aang turned to Naruto when Sokka eventually reached his spot on Appa's saddle. He questioned, you said whenever we wanted, right? Naruto muttered the final sentence to himself, pretty much. The next time we come back maybe we can spruce up the place a bit. Clean the buildings, replant the flowers and trees, maybe even add a movie theater. Together, the other three said, what, nothing important. Let's get going, was Naruto's reply. Aang nodded, turned to face forward, whipped Appa's reins, and uttered the magic words. Yip yip. And as they proceeded toward whatever destination was in front of them, they vanished far into the sky. Sokka questioned, you have no idea where we're going, do you? Well, Aang said sheepishly, I know it's close to water. When Sokka looked around the area they were currently flying over, all she could see was an endless ocean. Sokka said, that doesn't exactly help. They left the Southern Air Temple a few days ago, and thus far, the journey has gone rather smoothly. Aang revived the notion of riding on enormous koi fish since he had no specific destination in mind. The others agreed and let him take the lead since nothing else significant was going on. Unfortunately, things haven't exactly gone as planned. It wasn't too bad at first, but as the days went by, they became aware that they were a little lost. In order to allow Appa to rest and to try to locate them, they had to make several stops at random locations. On some of the landmasses close to the South Pole that were under the control of the Earth Kingdom, they occasionally landed on an island with no inhabitants, and on other occasions, they just so happened to stumble upon a tiny village. They only spoke to people in these villages to obtain supplies and to get directions so they would at least know the general route. Since they were clearly not local, some people paused to give them a close look, while others chose to ignore them completely. The siblings were easily identifiable as traveling water tribesmen by those who paid close attention, but Naruto and Aang were a sight to behold. There would undoubtedly be occasional eyebrow raises from two young men, one with rare bright yellow hair and whisker marks on his face, and the other wearing orange and yellow clothing with a tattoo of an arrow on his bald head. While the monk would later be brought back into the conversation when some of the village elders learned of his description, the blonde would continue to be a mystery but leave a positive impression on everyone he spoke to. Older people who knew a little about the long-gone air nomads would conjecture about the tattooed young man's true identity and share their theories with the locals. Word quickly spread throughout these villages, and before long, everyone was discussing an airbender who might have been one of Tama, not just any airbender, but the one who the world has been waiting a century to see again. The Avatar. When the villagers realized that, they immediately wanted to find the young group and question them. However, they disappeared as soon as they appeared, sometimes even leaving people speechless when they saw a sky bison soaring off into the distance. That brings the group to their current position over the vast southern ocean, where they are flying quickly. From his relaxed position at the side of the saddle, Naruto said, "Just relax a little, Sokka. Enjoy the fact that you finally get to see the world." "I am enjoying it, but I don't enjoy not knowing where I'm going." "You've been out here before, right? So why couldn't you get us back on track?" replied Sokka. Naruto said in a monotone, concentrating on the activity he was currently engaging in. "Well, when you take a nap for a few hours and wake up to find yourself on an island you've never been on in the middle of the ocean, you tend to lose your sense of direction." With a mental shrug, Sokka's focus was drawn to the whizzing noise emanating from Naruto's palms. Sokka questioned, "How long have you been doing that?" Naruto's gaze remained fixed on the quickly spinning marble ring in his hands. Aang let him borrow the marbles to kill time after demonstrating this airbending trick to him earlier. Naruto responded, "I don't know. 1, maybe 2 hours. I lost track. This, for some reason, is really amusing." Momo then appeared on the shinobi's shoulder to gaze at the marbles as well. Sokka said, "Sure it is," and then he turned to face his sister. "Katara, how are my pants coming along?" Katara looked up from where she was sewing the hole in her brother's pants. "Just give me a little more time. Why did you have to go and rip them again?" she inquired. Sokka appeared a little uncomfortable and stifled a chill. "These things tend to happen when your evasion training is upgraded from snowballs to kunai," he responded. The thought made Katara a little pale. When she was sleeping or strolling through one of the villages they visited, she must have missed the training session. Was Sokka going to be put through the grinder if she was already undergoing this kind of training? She glanced at Momo and Naruto, who were absorbed. "To think that idiot is so lethal," she thought. She was startled out of her reverie by her brother's voice asking, "So are they done yet?" She turned to face Sokka and said, "Huh? Hurry up, will ya? Use some of that girly sewing speed so I can get some warmth already. My legs are freezing," exclaimed Sokka, who had lost her pants. Katara gave her brother a blank look. "What does me being a girl have to do with it?" As he continued his activities, Naruto thought calmly, "You're treading dangerous waters, Sokka." Sokka sealed his demise by saying, "You know, like how girls are better at cooking, cleaning, and stuff." Sadly, Sokka was still able to retain some stereotypes in his subconscious, even though he has undoubtedly curbed the majority of his stereotypical thoughts over the years due to the sudden increase in interaction with the female warriors. Katara held the only partially repaired pair of pants for Sokka to see, raising an irritated eyebrow. "They're all done, and my girly skills did a fantastic job." As she threw the pants back to Sokka, she spoke with a phony sense of excitement. Sokka looked through the hole in his pants and quickly realized he had made a mistake. "Wait, I'm sorry. I can't wear these, Katara, please." "Don't worry, Sokka," Aang said, starting from Appa's head. "You won't need any pants where we're going, happily," he said. Without shattering his Fa section aid, Naruto thought calmly, "Sounds fun." After a little more flying time and a pair of pants that had been repaired after much pleading, the group was getting closer to an island in the distance. "We're getting close," Aang shouted with delight. "Those koi fish are meant to be here?" Naruto inquired. Aang was so excited that he was practically jumping. "Yeah, they. Look," he cut himself off and gestured excitedly to the water below. Peering at the mass of blue they were flying over, the other three all moved to the left side of the saddle. There seemed to be a school of the enormous koi fish Aang had mentioned beneath them. Some were swimming peacefully just below the surface, while others leapt out of the water in all their magnificent orange and yellow colors. Naruto whispered, "Wow, those are some big fish. Is it possible to catch those fish?" With a dreamy expression on his face, Sokka asked. The idea of capturing even one of these animals for a lavish feast was almost too much for the poor boy to handle. After giving Sokka's question some thought, Naruto said, "It shouldn't be impossible. What are you doing, Aang? Hold on." When Katara and Sokka heard Naruto's words, they turned their attention from the fish to Aang, who was fumbling with his clothes and removing them as quickly as he could. He already had his torso bare and was trying to remove his pants. I wanted to ride them, as I mentioned, in response. Aang grinned broadly and removed his pants, revealing only his brown underwear. But why are you taking off your clothes right now? Will you not wait until we arrive Ada? Aang abruptly leapt off Appa's side and made his way straight to the water, resolute in its mission like a torpedo, leaving Naruto's question unanswered. Aang. The three of them who were still on the bison quickly gathered next to one another to look over the side of the saddle to see where the young avatar made his impact. Katara screamed as she futilely reached out to grab him. As they observed, Aang's figure gradually shrank until they could see the splash that resulted from his collision with the water. The three of them were silent for a short while as they awaited their friend's return. Naruto let out a breath that seemed to have been held in for hours and asked, "Did we just witness the Avatar start his reincarnation process?" Sokka and Katara remained silent and kept looking at the water. When things started to get a little scary, even for the blonde, the water began to bubble at the surface until an elephant koi exploded into the air with a passenger hanging on its dorsal fin for dear life. Naruto, not really worried, kept watching and waiting. That passenger was an excessively happy Aang who was gliding along the water with his fishy companion while laughing uncontrollably.
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.